What if what we call love isn't really the choice of the heart, but just a clever disguise of biology? What if the passion we mistake for destiny is nothing more than nature's trick, keeping us blind to its real purpose? Arthur Schopenhauer argued that we are pawns in the hands of a blind force he called the will to life. This force doesn't ask for our opinion, doesn't consult our feelings. It simply drives us forward, making us crave, suffer, and crave again. Why do we fall for people who seem right for us, yet so often don't make us happy? Why does a marriage built on passion so often end in disappointment? And is there a way to break free from this endless cycle of desire? In this video, we'll dive into Schopenhauer's most controversial and most piercing ideas about love, marriage, and family. Watch until the end, and you'll see why he believed that behind every romantic story hides a darker mechanism of nature, and how understanding it might free us from illusion. Let's begin. Part 1. Perspectives on Women, Sexuality, and Romantic Love. Arthur Schopenhauer articulated a number of provocative and often troubling ideas about women, human sexuality, and love. These views were shaped not only by the biases and social conventions of his time, but also by his overarching metaphysical theory centered on the will. Although many of his specific assertions about gender have since been invalidated by modern science and social progress, his broader philosophical reflections on sexual desire continue to offer meaningful insights. Schopenhauer's exploration of sexuality is deeply entwined with his concept of the will to live, a blind driving force that underlies all existence. He argued that sexual desire is one of the most vivid expressions of this will, and understanding its role requires a careful distinction between his philosophical framework and his personal prejudices. While aspects of his reasoning are flawed or outdated, others still provoke serious thought about the human condition. He contended that even our most personal and intimate experiences, particularly those surrounding love and attraction, are ultimately subordinate to the will's fundamental aim, survival and reproduction. In Schopenhauer's view, what we interpret as emotional intimacy or romantic choice is actually the will's calculated effort to perpetuate life. Love, he suggested, is not what it seems. Rather than being rooted in personal happiness or conscious decision-making, romantic love is a strategic mechanism designed by the will. When individuals fall in love, they often believe they are responding to the distinct charm or personality of a specific person. They imagine that their feelings are rooted in the pursuit of individual happiness. However, Schopenhauer claimed this perception is an illusion. According to him, the will disguises itself as love to push individuals toward unions that will produce strong, viable offspring, regardless of whether these relationships bring lasting personal satisfaction. This process, which Schopenhauer termed the metaphysics of sexual love, involves an unconscious evaluation of genetic compatibility. The will orchestrates attraction between individuals whose traits will offset each other's weaknesses, increasing the likelihood of producing healthy children. We may be drawn to others who, on the surface, seem to match our tastes or ideals. But beneath this lies a deeper biological agenda. A tall person may be captivated by someone shorter. A highly rational person may fall for someone emotionally expressive. These pairings are not random. They are, according to Schopenhauer, the will's effort to create genetically balanced offspring. The strength of romantic attraction, then, reflects the biological potential of the union. The more genetically advantageous the combination appears, the more overpowering the passion tends to be. Yet, Schopenhauer also emphasized the internal conflict that arises from this biological programming. The very traits that fuel strong romantic attraction can later become sources of tension and incompatibility in daily life. What initially feels like complementarity in a partner can, over time, become a source of irritation and conflict. A person who once seemed like a perfect counterpart during the intensity of romantic love may later prove to be an ill-suited partner for a stable, long-term relationship. This disconnect explains why many marriages that begin with intense passion often unravel into dissatisfaction or resentment. Once the reproductive aim of the will has been fulfilled, the emotional intensity dissipates, and the individuals are left confronting the reality that their deeper happiness was never the will's concern. These ideas led Schopenhauer to adopt a bleak outlook on marriage and family life. He believed that the institution of marriage frequently traps individuals in a conflict between the demands of biology and the pursuit of personal well-being. The same forces that drive people to form families can also ensnare them in circumstances that hinder their freedom, deplete their energy, and obstruct their pursuit of self-actualization. Children, for Schopenhauer, represent the will's success in perpetuating life into the next generation. However, they also introduce immense responsibilities and emotional pressures that can stifle personal development. In his view, parenthood exemplifies how the will ensures individuals remain tethered to physical and material concerns, thereby keeping them from focusing on higher spiritual aims. Balancing the demands of family life presents a significant barrier to achieving the level of detachment and self-overcoming necessary for genuine liberation. Schopenhauer's perspective on women was deeply shaped by his belief that they were more closely bound to the biological imperatives of the will than men. He contended that because women are biologically tasked with childbirth and child-rearing, they tend to be more emotionally driven, attuned to immediate, practical matters, and less inclined toward abstract intellectual thought. From his point of view, women possessed a natural aptitude for managing social relationships. As such, skills played an essential evolutionary role in securing support and protection for themselves and their children. Men, he believed, had a greater capacity to disengage from biological imperatives and were thus more inclined to pursue abstract thought, creative expression, and philosophical inquiry. On this basis, Schopenhauer concluded that women were naturally suited for the domestic sphere, while men were better equipped for intellectual and cultural pursuits. He presented these roles not as arbitrary social constructs, but as expressions of inherent biological differences. It is, however, important to recognize that these conclusions were a product of the limited scientific understanding and prevailing societal norms of 19th century Europe, rather than objective philosophical truths. Schopenhauer rarely encountered women who were formally educated or professionally successful, largely because such paths were virtually inaccessible to women in his social context. His own troubled interactions with women likely colored his theoretical stance on gender. Contemporary psychological and sociological research has since demonstrated that many of the traits Schopenhauer attributed to biological sex are, in fact, shaped by cultural norms, socialization, and unequal access to education and opportunity. Modern studies reveal that men and women display far more similarities than differences in areas such as intelligence, emotional processing, and abstract reasoning. While Schopenhauer's broader philosophy, particularly his theory of the will, remains influential, most modern thinkers reject his gender-specific assertions. Nevertheless, one enduring insight from Schopenhauer's work is his understanding that sexual desire often operates independently of, and at times contrary to, rational self-interest. Today's psychological research affirms that many factors influencing romantic attraction and partner selection lie beneath conscious awareness and are rooted in evolutionary biology. People are frequently drawn to others for reasons they cannot clearly define, and these attractions often do not align with their stated preferences or values. The phenomenon of falling in love tends to bypass rational judgment, which can lead to impulsive choices that individuals later come to regret. By becoming aware of these unconscious dynamics, people can navigate romantic relationships with greater clarity and self-awareness. Such awareness includes acknowledging the profound, often irrational forces that shape emotional attachment. Schopenhauer's observation that sexual desire serves ends beyond individual fulfillment retains its relevance, even when stripped of the gendered assumptions in his original argument. He also explored how erotic desire contributes to suffering, not only for those directly involved, but across society at large. Issues like jealousy, unreciprocated love, and rivalry for romantic partners generate deep emotional pain, conflict, and even violence. The same instincts that fuel passionate love are responsible for intense emotional turmoil when desires are thwarted or relationships unravel. Moreover, the fleeting nature of sexual attraction often means that even initially fulfilling relationships can erode over time, leaving individuals disillusioned. People who once believed they had found an ideal partner may find that their feelings fade, or that the person they loved no longer resembles the one they knew. This sense of romantic disappointment plays a major role in the broader landscape of human suffering. Schopenhauer proposed celibacy as both a pathway to and a reflection of liberation from the will. He believed that sexual desire stands among the most intense and enduring expressions of the will, making it a formidable barrier to the detachment required for true spiritual awakening. As long as an individual continues to engage in sexual activity, they remain bound to the physiological and emotional mechanisms that tether consciousness to worldly matters. Yet Schopenhauer made it clear that celibacy should not be the result of imposed moral or religious dictates. Instead, it must emerge organically from a genuine decline in sexual appetite. When celibacy is forced, it tends to heighten rather than diminish obsessive thoughts about sex. In contrast, when abstinence arises naturally, it signals that the will is beginning to retreat from its grip on life. Although total renunciation of sexual desire is beyond reach for most people, recognizing how sexuality reinforces attachment to existence can weaken its compulsive hold. Even with his critical stance on romantic love and sexual desire, Schopenhauer conceded that such experiences can, at times, offer authentic glimpses into the deeper nature of being. The intensity of sexual attraction can momentarily dissolve the barriers of ego that usually isolate individuals from one another. In moments of profound romantic intimacy, People might feel a fleeting sense of unity and transcendence, an experience not unlike the serenity attained through aesthetic appreciation or moral clarity. Still, Schopenhauer warned that this kind of transcendence is typically short-lived, and in most cases it only deepens the individual's entanglement with the will. Sexual intimacy may seem to bridge the gap between selves, but in truth, it reinforces the instinctual forces that preserve personal identity and biological continuity. Authentic liberation, he argued, lies not in immersing oneself further in sexual experience, but in transcending it altogether. Part 2. Death, Suicide, and the Indestructibility of Being. Arthur Schopenhauer's reflections on death stand among the most profound and consoling aspects of his philosophy. He maintained that what we commonly refer to as death, the end of an individual's life, is not an absolute termination, but a transformation occurring within the world of appearances. For Schopenhauer, this phenomenal world, the domain of representation, is not ultimate reality. The deeper reality is the will, which exists independently of space and time. The will, according to Schopenhauer, is eternal. It is never born and never perishes. Instead, it continuously expresses itself through an infinite variety of forms and individual beings. Realizing this can free us from the paralyzing fear of death that afflicts much of human experience. It also sheds light on why suicide, although it may seem like an escape from suffering, ultimately fails to address the root of our existential unease. Death, in this framework, is not the negation of life, but simply one more event within the boundless unfolding of the will, no more final or absolute than falling asleep or changing one's clothes. This philosophical stance dramatically reorients our understanding of mortality and the significance of personal identity. When a person dies, what ends is merely the particular appearance of the will shaped by time, space, and individuality. The structures of consciousness that once sustained the illusion of separateness cease to function in that specific body. Yet the will, the inner essence animating that person, remains untouched and unaltered. Schopenhauer likens this to a wave returning to the sea. The wave, as a visible form, disappears, but the water that made it remains part of the ocean. In this same sense, the death of a human being marks the dissolution of personal identity and memory, not the extinction of what we fundamentally are. We don't transition to another place or become something else. Rather, we cease to manifest as distinct individuals. What is essential in us, the will, persists, as it always has, beyond individuality, unchanged and eternal. Understanding this helps clarify why the fear of death, while natural and widespread, is built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of our true nature. We fear death because we equate ourselves with our personal histories, our physical bodies, and our psychological traits. The thought of losing these aspects feels like total annihilation, but Schopenhauer argues that these features are merely surface-level expressions. They do not define our essence. Our real identity, he insists, is not bound to any particular form. It is the will itself, timeless and universal, which happens, for a time, to be expressed through the individual configuration we mistake for our entire self. Recognizing this more profound truth does not necessarily remove the natural resistance to physical death. but it does dispel the deeper existential dread that stems from believing death to be the end of all being. To support this vision, Schopenhauer drew attention to the absence of any distressing memory of our state before birth. We do not view our pre-birth non-existence as a condition of suffering or loss. If death merely returns us to that same non-manifested state, there is no reason to fear it more than we regret not existing before we were born. This comparison serves to dismantle the illusion that death is a tragedy for our true selves. The distress many people associate with death arises from picturing it as a conscious experience of deprivation, a continued awareness deprived of everything it values. But this notion is based on a confusion between the phenomenal self, our temporary, individual form, and the essential self, the eternal will. What actually dies is only the appearance, not the underlying reality. In essence, what we truly are has no beginning and no end. It was never born, and therefore cannot die. He also noted that the same vital force animating our individual lives is equally present throughout the natural world. When we observe the emergence of new plants, the birth of animals, or the maturation of young people, we are witnessing that same underlying drive, the will, that defines our own being, now expressing itself in new and varied forms. The vitality we feel within ourselves is not something that originates at birth or vanishes at death. Rather, it is a temporary concentration of a universal life force that pervades all living things. In this view, we are already part of a kind of immortality by virtue of our connection to this ongoing, ever-unfolding expression of the will. While individual forms arise and disappear, the essential reality that reveals itself through those forms remains constant and indestructible. Death, then, does not mark the end of our involvement in this deeper reality. Instead, it signifies a transformation in the way we participate in it. This understanding led Schopenhauer to a unique and layered perspective on suicide, one that stood apart from both the religious condemnation of self-destruction and the secular belief that it might be a rational escape from suffering. In his view, suicide is neither a sin against divine authority nor a sound philosophical answer to the pains of life. Rather, Schopenhauer believed suicide reveals a profound confusion about the nature of suffering and the path to genuine liberation. The person who takes their own life typically still harbors the desire to live, but finds their present situation unbearable. What they truly wish to escape is the suffering caused by their own willing, even as they continue to affirm the fundamental will to live, the very source of all suffering. In this way, suicide eliminates the outer appearance of life, but leaves the deeper root of suffering untouched. From Schopenhauer's perspective, suicide represents an attempt to resolve the wrong issue using the wrong means. The real source of human anguish does not lie in external hardships, but in the inner mechanism of the will itself, a structure that guarantees dissatisfaction no matter the circumstances. A person may end their life due to poverty, illness, unrequited love, or public shame. Yet these external triggers are not the true origin of suffering. They merely activate the deeper, inescapable turmoil inherent in the will. Even if all these particular problems were to vanish, the nature of the will would ensure new dissatisfactions would soon arise. Moreover, the act of suicide itself is not a release from the will, but a violent assertion of it. True liberation, Schopenhauer argued, involves rising above the will entirely, not yielding to it in a final desperate act. Suicide is ultimately a fervent, emotionally charged reaction to suffering, not the serene, detached renunciation that comes with genuine insight. Nonetheless, Schopenhauer made a critical distinction between suicide and the slow inward turning away from life that characterizes the true denial of the will. The enlightened individual, the saint or sage, does not reject life out of anguish or aggression. Instead, their attachment to personal existence gradually dissolves. This detachment is not born of despair, but of a deep and quiet surrender. Such individuals may continue living long after reaching this state, carrying on their physical existence without clinging to it, and viewing the continuation or cessation of life with complete indifference. When death eventually arrives for such a person, it is the natural culmination of a process that had already begun internally, long before the body ceased to function. This kind of death involves no pain or fear, for there is no longer a personal ego left to grieve or resist its dissolution. Schopenhauer exhibited profound empathy toward individuals who chose to end their own lives, even as he identified the philosophical misconceptions that often underlie such decisions. He acknowledged that the intensity of suffering, whether psychological or physical, can reach a point where clear, rational thought becomes unattainable. When anguish becomes overwhelming, the capacity for the kind of reflective insight needed to recognize the deeper implications of suicide may be lost. The very urgency and despair that drive someone towards self-destruction can also obstruct access to the philosophical clarity that might offer real relief. Schopenhauer did not interpret suicide as a moral wrongdoing. Instead, he regarded it as a tragic outcome of human suffering compounded by a lack of true understanding about the nature of existence. His philosophical approach was never aimed at condemnation, but at offering insight and solace, tools that could, ideally, help someone step back from the edge. This perspective on death as a transition rather than an obliteration also shapes how we respond to the deaths of those we hold dear. Mourning is a natural and meaningful response to the loss of a loved one. However, grief that becomes overwhelming or unending may indicate the same fundamental misunderstanding about death that fuels our own fear of dying. The person we grieve has not vanished into nothingness. Rather, they have ceased to appear in the form familiar to us. The essence of who they were, their innermost will, which defined their true being, continues as part of the timeless reality underlying all manifestations. This does not suggest that the unique traits or memories of the individual endure in a recognizable way, but it does affirm that the core of their being has not been erased or destroyed. Grasping this deeper truth can offer real solace in times of loss. It allows us to genuinely mourn while also recognizing a more profound continuity, one that honors both the pain of our separation and the enduring essence that lies beyond all change. Part 3. Religion, Buddhism, and Christianity. Arthur Schopenhauer's engagement with religion was both intricate and distinctive, setting him apart from most thinkers of his time. Though he rejected the personal, deity-centered theism characteristic of mainstream European Christianity, he deeply respected the spiritual depth found in mystical and ascetic traditions, particularly those within Buddhism and the more contemplative forms of Christianity. Schopenhauer believed that the core insights attained by the greatest spiritual teachers throughout history were essentially the same truths he had uncovered through rigorous philosophical investigation. At its highest expression, religion offered, in his view, a practical roadmap for transcending suffering and attaining inner peace. Yet, when distorted or institutionalized, religion could devolve into a mechanism for social control, obscuring rather than illuminating the deeper realities of existence. This dual approach enabled him to revere the wisdom of religious traditions while remaining firmly committed to reason, critical thinking, and philosophical autonomy. His unique synthesis of Eastern and Western religious philosophies, interpreted through a rational lens, became one of his most original and lasting contributions to intellectual history. Among world religions, Buddhism held a particularly prominent place in Schopenhauer's system, as he saw it as the most faithful and systematic embodiment of the philosophical truths he had arrived at independently. He found a striking resonance between the Buddha's Four Noble Truths and his own analysis of human suffering. The first truth, that life is inherently marked by suffering, mirrored his pessimistic view of existence as dominated by the relentless striving of the will. The second noble truth, that suffering is caused by craving and attachment, closely aligned with his conviction that the will's ceaseless desires inevitably lead to dissatisfaction and unrest. The third, that liberation from suffering is possible by eliminating its root causes, corresponded to his vision of deliverance through the renunciation of the will to live. And the fourth noble truth, detailing the path toward liberation, reflected his understanding of how aesthetic experience, ethical awareness, and ascetic discipline could elevate one beyond ordinary consciousness. Schopenhauer was especially drawn to the Buddhist concept of nirvana, interpreting it as the total extinguishment of personal willing and the realization of a serene and undisturbed state. Unlike the Christian idea of heaven, which promised eternal joy for the individual soul, nirvana, in his view, implied the dissolution of individuality altogether, an end to personal desire and subjective existence. This conception resonated deeply with his belief that true liberation lies not in satisfying the will, but in completely transcending it. He admired Buddhism's emphasis on meditation, detachment, and the recognition of impermanence, viewing them as practical techniques for attaining the transformative consciousness he described in his philosophy. The Buddhist notion that individual existence is fundamentally illusory also harmonized with his understanding of Maya, the veil of appearances that separates us from ultimate reality. He frequently cited Buddhist scriptures and considered his own work to be a rational, Western articulation of the profound truths that Buddhism had preserved through centuries of meditative practice and spiritual inquiry. At the same time, Schopenhauer was aware of significant differences between his philosophical framework and traditional Buddhist doctrines. Buddhism, as a religious tradition, often presents its teachings within a context that includes beliefs in karma, reincarnation, and cosmic justice, concepts that Schopenhauer found difficult to accept on strictly rational grounds. Though he acknowledged these ideas could serve as useful symbolic representations of the will's continuity across various forms, he did not regard them as literal accounts of personal survival after death. He respected Buddhist moral teachings and psychological insights, but remained cautious about endorsing its metaphysical and cosmological claims. Similarly, while he valued meditation as a method for fostering the inner transformation he advocated, he insisted that such practices be interpreted through a philosophical, not supernatural, framework. Schopenhauer's goal was to extract the essential wisdom from Buddhism and render it intelligible through concepts grounded in reason, thus offering a philosophical restatement of its most profound truths without reliance on dogma or mystical belief. Schopenhauer's engagement with Christianity was marked by a deeper complexity and ambivalence than his clear admiration for Buddhism. He firmly rejected the conventional Christian portrayal of a personal God, one who creates the world, judges humanity, and intervenes in the natural order. To Schopenhauer, this anthropomorphic concept of the divine was essentially a refined form of myth-making, shaped more by human psychological needs than by any objective understanding of reality. He viewed the Christian doctrine of eternal reward and punishment as an extension of the ego-driven mindset that fuels human suffering, rather than a path to transcendence. Additionally, Schopenhauer was sharply critical of the historical role institutional Christianity had played in consolidating political power, suppressing intellectual freedom, and perpetuating social injustices. In his view, organized religion often betrayed the spiritual and ethical principles it was meant to uphold. Despite these criticisms, Schopenhauer held a deep respect for the mystical and ascetic strands within the Christian tradition. He was particularly moved by the lives and teachings of saints who had transcended worldly attachments, finding in them a reflection of his own philosophical ideals. He admired thinkers like Meister Eckhart, whose vision of the soul merging with the divine resonated with Schopenhauer's concept of the denial of the will to live. Christian values such as love, compassion, and self-sacrifice also found a meaningful place in his ethical framework. For Schopenhauer, these virtues arose from a recognition of the essential oneness that lies beneath the illusion of separateness. The Christian imperative to love thy neighbor as thyself struck him not as mere moral advice, but as a literal expression of the truth that the self and the other are ultimately one and the same. The Christian call to renounce material desires and personal ambition harmonized with Schopenhauer's vision of liberation through the quieting of the will. His objections were not directed at these spiritual insights themselves, but at the theological scaffolding in which they were often embedded, a framework he found intellectually indefensible. Schopenhauer contended that the greatest religious figures in history attained profound insight into the nature of existence through deep contemplation. These figures, including the Buddha and Jesus, accessed the same core truths about suffering, compassion, and liberation, though they expressed them through different languages, symbols, and narratives suited to their respective cultures. He believed that the variety of religious traditions did not represent fundamentally opposing views of reality, but rather reflected diverse cultural interpretations of a shared wisdom. This view enabled him to respect the essential messages of many religions while remaining critical of their specific dogmas and institutional structures. In Schopenhauer's mind, his own philosophical system offered a universal and rational framework that could synthesize the highest teachings of world religions while stripping away their culturally bound and logically problematic elements. To him, philosophy and religion, at their best, were united in their pursuit of ultimate truth, addressing the same existential concerns and reaching congruent conclusions. This belief led Schopenhauer to develop what could be described as a form of philosophical religiosity, a synthesis of rational inquiry and contemplative practice. He argued that a purely intellectual grasp of concepts like will and representation was insufficient. What was needed was direct, lived experience of these truths. Merely understanding the illusory nature of the ego was not the same as personally experiencing its dissolution. Similarly, recognizing the futility of striving was not equivalent to genuinely losing one's attachment to worldly goals. Practices such as meditation, reflection, and disciplined asceticism could serve as vital tools for bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge and transformative realization. However, Schopenhauer was adamant that such practices must be grounded in rational understanding. They should not be pursued as acts of faith or as means of securing divine favor or posthumous reward, but as methods for attaining a shift in consciousness, one that offers immediate inner peace and freedom from suffering. Schopenhauer's respect for the insights found in religious traditions significantly shaped his critique of the superficial optimism and materialism that characterized much of Enlightenment thinking. Although he held reason and scientific exploration in high regard, he believed that secular philosophies frequently failed to grapple with the profound questions of meaning, suffering, and transcendence, questions that religion had long sought to address. The Enlightenment's focus on progress, personal happiness, and worldly success struck Schopenhauer as perpetuating the very illusions responsible for human suffering. In contrast, religious traditions, despite their conceptual shortcomings, had at least acknowledged that conventional consciousness and prevailing societal values were insufficient when it came to confronting the most fundamental human concerns. These traditions had preserved both insights and practices aimed at helping individuals rise above the ego-driven mindset that, in his view, lies at the root of most suffering. Schopenhauer saw his philosophical work as a continuation of religion's deeper mission, addressing ultimate questions of existence. However, he sought to update this mission by employing the tools and clarity of modern philosophical reasoning. At the same time, Schopenhauer was deeply critical of the dangers posed by religious institutions when they devolved into fanaticism, rigid dogma, or corrupt power structures. When spiritual truths were reduced to inflexible doctrines that demanded blind adherence, religion lost its transformative power. It ceased to enlighten and instead became a barrier to understanding. Moreover, when religious institutions aligned themselves with political authority or became instruments of social control, they frequently acted in direct contradiction to the compassionate and liberating ideals they claimed to uphold. Rituals, too, became hollow when performed out of custom or social obligation rather than sincere spiritual pursuit. In such cases, they no longer served their original purpose of fostering inner freedom and growth. For Schopenhauer, authentic religion needed to be reclaimed, stripped of its historical layers of superstition, ambition, and intellectual dishonesty. What mattered most was a return to its core essence, an honest, courageous, and rigorous search for truth. True religion, like true philosophy, required integrity of thought and a readiness to follow insight wherever it might lead, even into uncomfortable territory. His integration of religious sensibility with philosophical rigor had a lasting influence on later thinkers who were seeking alternatives to both orthodox religion and superficial materialism. Schopenhauer demonstrated that it was entirely possible to draw upon the wisdom of religious traditions without subscribing to their supernatural elements, and to engage in a genuine spiritual path without renouncing rational inquiry. This approach appealed to a wide range of writers, artists, and philosophers who were spiritually inclined but unable to accept traditional theological systems. It also helped spark the growing Western fascination with Eastern philosophies and meditative disciplines, a movement that gained considerable momentum throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Schopenhauer showed that the dialogue between Western rationalism and Eastern contemplative insight need not be antagonistic, but could instead lead to mutual enrichment. Through his work, Schopenhauer helped lay the groundwork for a form of spirituality grounded in both philosophical reasoning and experiential wisdom, an approach that honored the contributions of both reason and contemplative awareness. Part 4. Knowledge, Science, and Empirical Understanding. Schopenhauer crafted an intricate epistemological framework that explored not only the capabilities of human cognition, but also its intrinsic boundaries. Drawing inspiration from Kant's assertion that mental structures shape our experiences, he extended this idea by asserting that the will lies at the very heart of all knowledge, serving as the key to grasping the true nature of reality. He maintained that, although scientific knowledge boasts immense practical utility and intellectual rigor, it is confined to the domain of appearances. It deals exclusively with representations. As such, science is unable to penetrate the inner essence of things. Yet, despite this limitation, Schopenhauer regarded science as the pinnacle of rational inquiry and appreciated its power to uncover the underlying patterns and interconnections that govern the phenomenal world. For Schopenhauer, recognizing both the power and the limitations of scientific inquiry was essential to his broader philosophical aim, pointing beyond rationality to a direct, intuitive insight into the will's nature. His theory of knowledge laid the groundwork for his entire metaphysical system, making clear why this system ultimately required a mode of understanding that surpasses conventional rational thought. In Schopenhauer's view, all knowledge begins with our immediate perception of individual objects situated in space and time. This sensory-based understanding is vivid, detailed, and directly accessible to consciousness. However, it is confined to particular instances and events, specific things we perceive through sight, sound, touch, and other senses. When we see a tree, hear a melody, or feel a rough surface, we are engaging with concrete expressions of the will, though we are not yet grasping the broader laws or universal principles behind these experiences. This perceptual awareness offers the essential foundation upon which all more complex forms of understanding are built. Nonetheless, it cannot by itself provide explanations, make predictions, or organize phenomena into a coherent system. To achieve this, we must rely on our uniquely human capacity for abstract and conceptual thinking, an ability that allows us to transcend the limitations of immediate perception and form general knowledge about categories of objects and their interrelations. The shift from intuitive perception to abstract reasoning marks a dual transformation. It expands our cognitive reach while simultaneously reducing the richness of sensory immediacy. Conceptual thought functions by organizing specific perceptions into general classes and discerning the relationships among them. For example, when we form the idea of a tree, we abstract away from the myriad differences between individual trees and concentrate on the features they share in common. This enables us to think about trees as a general concept, rather than only those particular ones we've personally encountered. Such abstraction allows us to make universally applicable statements like, trees need sunlight to grow, which hold true beyond our immediate experiences. While this kind of knowledge grants us wide-ranging understanding and the ability to predict future occurrences, it necessarily sacrifices the depth and detail found in first-hand perception. The concept tree can represent countless real-world examples, but it encapsulates far less specific information than perceiving a single tree in its full sensory context. Science exemplifies the most advanced and systematic form of conceptual knowledge. It seeks universal laws and causal relationships that explain the workings of the natural world. Scientific methods identify recurring patterns in nature and articulate them through precise, often mathematical, formulations. For instance, when physics determines that force equals mass times acceleration, it is articulating a fundamental law that holds true across all relevant physical interactions. Similarly, chemistry unveils the atomic makeup of various elements, laying bare the principles behind their behavior. Biology, through its exploration of heredity and evolution, exposes the universal mechanisms that drive life itself. Through these endeavors, science achieves an extraordinary level of generality and accuracy, revealing the logical, mathematical, and structural frameworks that unify the diversity of natural phenomena under common principles. Nonetheless, Schopenhauer contended that even the most advanced scientific understanding remains inherently restricted, because it operates exclusively within the realm of representation, explaining how phenomena relate to one another through space, time, and causality. It cannot address the deeper metaphysical question of why phenomena exist in the first place. Science explains the connections between appearances, but it cannot uncover the underlying force, the will, that generates and sustains the entire representational world. Science excels at uncovering the causal relationships between events and expressing them through precise mathematical formulas. Yet, it stops short of revealing the true essence of the forces behind those formulas. For example, physics can describe the behavior of gravity with astonishing accuracy, but it cannot answer what gravity is in its fundamental nature, only how it behaves. Biology, likewise, can chart the intricate workings of living systems, offering detailed models of how life functions. However, it cannot define what life is at its core, beyond its visible and measurable expressions. Science is confined to phenomena, operating within the realm of observable appearances. It has no direct access to the underlying reality that gives rise to those appearances. This limitation becomes especially apparent when science attempts to grapple with consciousness and the nature of subjective experience. Neuroscience can track patterns of brain activity linked to specific mental states, and even forecast certain behaviors based on neural data. But it remains unable to explain how physical processes in the brain generate first-person experience. It cannot bridge the explanatory gap between neural activity and what it's like to feel, to see the color red, to suffer pain, or to experience love. The scientific method is fundamentally structured to investigate external, measurable realities. Consciousness, by contrast, is intrinsically internal. It can only be accessed from within, through direct subjective awareness. This makes it permanently elusive to objective study. No matter how advanced our tools become or how refined our theories are, consciousness will always resist complete scientific explanation. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer emphasized that recognizing this boundary is essential for maintaining intellectual humility. While scientific inquiry is immensely powerful within its proper domain, it becomes misleading when it claims to offer a total explanation of existence. Materialist philosophies that reduce all of reality to physical processes governed by scientific laws fall into a fundamental error. They confuse the map with the territory, mistaking the conceptual structures of science, which are representations of experience, for the underlying reality itself. Scientific laws are not the essence of the universe. They are constructs of the mind used to organize our perception of it. This doesn't diminish the value of science, but it does highlight the necessity of other modes of understanding. If we wish to explore the deepest questions about reality, science alone is insufficient. It can describe how the world appears to us, but not what the world is in itself, or why it appears at all. This insight also helps explain why science, when applied in isolation, often fails to resolve the most profound human problems. Neuroscience might uncover the biological basis of depression, but such knowledge alone rarely provides the inner peace or meaning that those who suffer most deeply are seeking. Sociology may reveal the systemic roots of inequality and conflict, but it doesn't automatically teach us how to lead a good life in a flawed and unjust world. Medicine can cure disease and extend life, but it does not offer answers to the existential questions of suffering, death, and the human condition, questions that touch every life, regardless of physical health. To address these enduring concerns, we must turn to forms of insight that reach beyond empirical analysis, drawing on philosophy, contemplative practice, and direct experiential knowledge of consciousness itself. Science is indispensable for mastering the material world, but it cannot substitute for the inner journey of self-awareness and spiritual insight that heals suffering at its source. Schopenhauer also explored the relationship between scientific understanding and the knowledge found in art and philosophy. Science is concerned with uncovering the general laws that apply across categories of phenomena. Art, on the other hand, discloses the eternal forms and ideals expressed in individual concrete manifestations. For instance, a scientific analysis of roses might delve into their cell structure, genetic coding, and evolutionary background. But an artist's portrayal of a rose captures something else entirely: the timeless beauty, vitality, and harmony that the rose symbolizes. Both science and art yield valuable knowledge, yet they offer distinct kinds of truth. Science enables us to explain, control, and predict. Art invites us to contemplate, feel, and intuit deeper meanings. Philosophy attempts to unify these perspectives, offering rational reflection on the ultimate questions that science cannot resolve and art can only gesture toward through metaphor and imagery. According to Schopenhauer, the ideal relationship between science and philosophy is grounded in mutual regard and a clear delineation of responsibilities. Science ought to explore the natural world through observation and experimentation, unimpeded by philosophical assumptions about what its findings should be. Conversely, philosophy must retain the freedom to grapple with fundamental questions of purpose, value, and existence, unconstrained by the methodological boundaries that define scientific inquiry. Each discipline has the capacity to enhance and illuminate the other, provided neither oversteps into the other's domain or claims exclusive authority over it. When scientists dismiss philosophical considerations about the scope and nature of knowledge, they risk adopting simplistic or overly mechanistic worldviews. Likewise, philosophers who disregard scientific advancements may construct ideas that are detached from the observable universe. The most fruitful path lies in a balanced integration, one that marries the empirical precision of science with the contemplative depth of philosophy. Such a fusion enables a more comprehensive understanding, one that honors both the capabilities and the limitations of human intellect, while remaining receptive to insights that go beyond the reach of purely rational thought. Part 5. The World as Will and Representation. Arthur Schopenhauer's entire philosophy is grounded in a single, radical realization, an idea he regarded as his most profound discovery. He asserted that reality is composed of two distinct but comprehensible dimensions. Grasping this duality, he believed, unlocks an understanding of existence, the nature of suffering, and the path to liberation. This foundational insight became the core of his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, which he published in 1818 at the age of 30. Although largely overlooked by scholars at first, the work would go on to be recognized as one of the most influential contributions to Western philosophy. The first of the two dimensions of reality, according to Schopenhauer, is what he called the world as representation. This refers to everything that appears to us, everything perceived through our senses or processed in our thoughts. When you observe a tree, you're aware of a green structure with leaves and branches, rooted in a particular place and time. When you listen to music, you're engaged with tones arranged in rhythm, melody, and harmony, unfolding moment by moment. Even when reflecting on abstract mathematical concepts or recalling personal memories, you're engaging with mental representations, images, ideas, and symbols formed in the mind. All these experiences belong to the world as representation. Schopenhauer made a critical observation about this realm of appearances. Everything we encounter through perception or thought is organized by certain inborn frameworks that our minds impose on reality. These structuring elements are space, time, and causality. We never perceive anything that isn't situated somewhere in space and at some point in time. Nor do we witness events that lack causes or fail to produce effects. These principles shape the totality of what we can experience or comprehend within the realm of representation. This idea was deeply influenced by the work of Immanuel Kant. Kant had proposed that space, time, and causation are not intrinsic properties of the external world, but are instead mental structures through which we interpret sensory data. For Kant, we cannot access reality in its pure form. Instead, we only perceive it as shaped by these mental filters. He termed this structured reality the phenomenal world, and contrasted it with the unknowable realm of reality as it exists independently of our perception, the noumenal world, or the thing in itself. Schopenhauer embraced Kant's distinction, but believed he had uncovered what Kant had not, the true nature of the thing in itself. While we cannot observe it through sensory experience or logical analysis, Schopenhauer argued that we do possess a unique first-hand access to it, not externally, but internally, through our direct awareness of our own will. When you experience hunger, anger, fear, sexual desire, or any strong emotion, you aren't simply observing a mental image or representation of these feelings. You are experiencing something more fundamental, the raw essence of being. Schopenhauer identified this direct internal encounter as the will. By will, Schopenhauer did not mean deliberate choices or conscious intentions. Instead, he referred to a deeper, unconscious force that underlies not just voluntary actions, but all physiological and psychological processes. The beating of your heart, the functioning of your organs, your body's response to threats, your cravings for food, safety, companionship, or recognition, all of these originate from the will. This will, he argued, is the true inner core of your being, what you are in essence, beneath all the ideas and images you associate with your identity. Yet Schopenhauer's insight extended beyond the human individual. He claimed that the same primal force you experience within yourself also constitutes the inner reality of everything in the universe. The energy that drives a plant to reach for the sun is identical in nature to your own hunger. The instinct compelling a bird to build a nest is the same will that urges you to seek a comfortable home. Even the gravitational pull that governs the movement of planets and stars, he claimed, is an expression of the same universal will that fuels human attraction and desire. At the most profound level, all of existence is animated by a single, unified will, one essence taking on an infinite variety of forms throughout nature and the cosmos. The vast multiplicity and diversity we perceive in the world are, at their core, illusions shaped by the structuring principles of space, time, and causality. When we observe countless distinct beings and objects, we are in fact witnessing a single underlying will filtered through the lens of representation, much like a beam of white light split into a spectrum of colors by a prism. Although the colors seem separate and unique, they are merely different expressions of one and the same light. In the same way, all individuals and objects are varied manifestations of a singular, unified will. Their apparent separateness is a result of how our minds process and organize experience. Schopenhauer identified several distinct levels at which this will reveals itself within the realm of representation. At its most basic, the will appears as the elemental forces of nature, gravity, magnetism, and the chemical tendencies of attraction and repulsion. Ascending from there, it takes the form of biological processes, growth, metabolism, and reproduction. At a more advanced stage, the will reveals itself in the instincts and behaviors of animals. The urge to hunt, evade threats, seek companionship, and nurture offspring. At its highest and most complex manifestation, the will becomes human consciousness, which encompasses rational thought, creativity, moral awareness, and philosophical reflection. Each successive level incorporates and transcends those below it, meaning that the human being embodies within itself every earlier form in which the will has appeared. According to Schopenhauer, the will possesses several defining features that set it apart from the world of appearances. First and foremost, the will exists beyond the dimensions of space and time. While its individual expressions appear to occur in specific locations and moments, the will itself is eternal and ever-present. It resides nowhere in particular because it is the inner essence of all things, everywhere. The will has no origin in time and no end, for time itself is merely a mode of perception through which the will becomes visible to us. It simply exists, timeless, placeless, and without duration. Secondly, the will is fundamentally one and indivisible. Though it seems fragmented into countless beings and objects, this fragmentation exists only in the world as we perceive it. In its essence, the will is a single, undivided force with no separations, no boundaries. As a result, the distinctions we draw between self and other, between individuals and objects, are ultimately superficial and illusory. At the most profound level of reality, there is no true division or individuality. There is only one unified will expressing itself in a limitless variety of forms within the representational world. A third key characteristic of the will is its blindness and lack of rationality. It does not possess consciousness, intellect, or purpose in the conventional sense. The will does not think, choose, or plan. It is sheer striving, pure energy, a relentless force pushing toward ever greater expression. When we witness the apparent intelligence behind nature, such as the complex design of living organisms or the elegant precision of planetary motion, we are not seeing a conscious act of creation. Rather, we are observing the unconscious order that arises when a blind force follows eternal laws and patterns. Lastly, the will is marked by ceaseless striving and an inability to reach lasting fulfillment. It never arrives at a final destination or a state of complete satisfaction. Every momentary fulfillment quickly gives way to new desires and needs. A plant that grows successfully towards sunlight immediately continues striving for nutrients, water, and reproduction. An animal that has fed will soon seek out more food, protection, or mates. A person who attains wealth, status, or love will inevitably be confronted by fresh ambitions and cravings. The will is caught in an endless loop: desire, brief satisfaction, and renewed desire. This perpetual cycle lies at the heart of why, for Schopenhauer, suffering is woven into the very fabric of existence. Schopenhauer's identification of the will as the true essence of reality, the thing in itself, had deep and far-reaching consequences for how we understand human nature and existence. It suggested that what we typically regard as our personal identity is not truly fundamental, but rather a fleeting and deceptive appearance of something far more universal and enduring. What we call our self, our individual preferences, fears, and the sense of separateness from others is, in fact, just a surface-level phenomenon. Everything we experience as individuality belongs to what Schopenhauer termed the world of representation. Beneath that surface lies your real nature, the universal will, a force that animates all beings equally. Coming to terms with this reality, in Schopenhauer's view, marks the beginning of genuine insight into the causes of suffering and the potential for liberation. It shows that the supposed divisions between the self and the external world, between observer and observed, between the particular and the universal, are not as absolute as they seem. This philosophical realization has powerful implications for every area of human life. When you find yourself in competition with others, it's because you've lost sight of the fact that you and they are expressions of the same underlying force. When you pursue fulfillment through outward accomplishments or material success, you're mistakenly looking for satisfaction in the realm of appearances rather than seeking a deeper understanding of the will. When you fear death, you are clinging to the illusion of being merely an isolated, individual entity instead of recognizing your true identity as part of the eternal will. And when you experience loneliness or alienation, you are believing in boundaries that, in truth, exist only within the world of appearances. To truly grasp the relationship between will and representation is to open the door to a radically different mode of being, one in which life is not confined by the illusions of separateness, desire, or fear, but grounded in the recognition of a shared, universal essence. Part 6. The Principle of Sufficient Reason. Before articulating his mature philosophical framework centered on the concepts of will and representation, Arthur Schopenhauer laid the groundwork for his later thought in his doctoral dissertation, which focused on a concept he termed the Principle of Sufficient Reason. Written at the age of just 22, this early work became the cornerstone upon which all his subsequent ideas were built. The Principle of Sufficient Reason asserts that everything that exists or occurs does so for a definite reason. It has a ground or explanation for why it is the case, rather than otherwise. While this may initially seem like an intuitive or self-evident claim, Schopenhauer's rigorous examination of the principle unveiled essential aspects of how we structure and interpret experience and knowledge. He distinguished 4 separate manifestations of the principle, each corresponding to a different domain of our cognitive engagement with the world. According to Schopenhauer, earlier philosophers had largely overlooked these distinctions, resulting in conceptual confusion and flawed theories. By precisely articulating the differences between these 4 types, he aimed to illuminate the mechanisms behind understanding, causality, reasoning, and motivation. More significantly, this framework would later serve as a stepping stone for identifying the limits of rational inquiry and directing attention to the more fundamental reality he would call the will. The first form he identified is the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, which governs our experience of physical events and transformations in space and time. In this mode, every physical change must have a preceding cause that explains its occurrence. For instance, when one billiard ball strikes another, the motion of the second ball is explained by the impact of the first. Similarly, when water begins to boil upon heating, the applied heat serves as the sufficient reason for the transition in state. This causal reasoning enables us to interpret and predict material phenomena by tracing sequences of cause and effect. It forms the basis of all empirical science and practical understanding of the natural world. However, Schopenhauer was keen to point out that causality explains only changes. It does not account for the existence of the objects themselves. While we can understand why a stone falls when released, we cannot, through causal reasoning alone, explain why stones, or anything at all, exist in the first place. Causation links events through time, but cannot offer insight into the ultimate origin or existence of things. This limitation is crucial for recognizing why science, regardless of how advanced or comprehensive, remains silent on the most profound metaphysical questions. Scientific knowledge can describe how phenomena occur and predict future outcomes, but it cannot explain why there is something rather than nothing. To approach such foundational questions, Schopenhauer turned to a different kind of explanation, the principle of sufficient reason of knowing. This second form applies not to temporal events, but to logical thought and mathematical reasoning. Here, every legitimate conclusion must follow from premises that justify it through adequate logical support. In mathematics, for example, each theorem must be derived from established axioms and prior theorems, using valid rules of inference. In this domain, reasoning adheres to strict logical forms that ensure conclusions are necessarily true if the premises are true. Unlike causal reasoning, which deals with sequences in time, logical reasoning concerns itself with relations between concepts and the coherence of propositions. It allows us to build internally consistent bodies of knowledge grounded in rational structure. Schopenhauer emphasized that this form of reasoning must not be confused with causal thinking, even though the two are often mistakenly conflated. A logical conclusion is not caused by its premises in the way one event causes another. Rather, it is implied by them. Logic uncovers timeless relationships of meaning and implication among abstract concepts. For example, when we assert that all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human, it follows necessarily that Socrates is mortal. This isn't a narrative of events unfolding in time, but a recognition of a permanent logical connection between ideas. Understanding this crucial distinction helps differentiate between empirical knowledge, which arises from observation, and rational knowledge, which derives from the structure of thought itself. The third pathway is the principle of sufficient reason of being, which underlies our perception of space and time themselves. Every point in space and every instant in time must be understood in terms of their relation to other points and moments. A location can only be defined by referencing its direction and distance relative to other positions. Likewise, a moment in time can only be recognized by situating it within a sequence of other moments. Space and time are not standalone containers that exist independently of the events and objects they encompass. Rather, they serve as relational frameworks that help us structure our experience and differentiate between things. This perspective led Schopenhauer to align with Kant in holding that space and time are not objective features of the external world, but forms of intuition shaped by the human mind. We never perceive objects apart from their spatial and temporal dimensions, because these qualities are imposed by our cognitive faculties, not discovered in the external world. The principle of sufficient reason of being clarifies how we construct the mental framework that makes experience itself possible. Without this structure, we would be unable to tell objects apart, recognize individual entities, or observe changes across time. Yet this framework is not found in the world. It is something we project onto our experiences. This insight is fundamental to understanding the divide between the world as it appears to us and the deeper reality Schopenhauer calls the will. The fourth pathway is the principle of sufficient reason of acting, which governs human behavior and motivation. Every human action is rooted in a motive that accounts for why one particular action was taken instead of another, or why action was taken at all. When someone decides to go shopping, some desire or necessity must have prompted that choice. When an individual selects one career path over another, there must be reasons why that option was more compelling than the alternatives. This form of explanation enables us to comprehend and predict human behavior by identifying the beliefs, values, and desires that drive individuals to act. It forms the foundation for disciplines such as psychology, ethics, and the social sciences. Schopenhauer stressed that motives function as causes within the domain of human action, but they exert influence not through physical force, but via conscious awareness. A motive must appear in consciousness as something desirable or necessary before it can incite action. Consequently, the same external event may inspire different actions in different people, based on their personal interpretation and valuation of the situation. For instance, a thunderstorm might prompt one person to seek shelter, while another might be drawn outside to enjoy its intensity. The variance lies not in the external event itself, but in each individual's subjective experience of it. To grasp human motivation, one must account for both the external context and the internal mental processes at play. However, Schopenhauer also argued that our motives are ultimately rooted in forces that lie beyond the reach of conscious thought. We may be able to pinpoint the immediate reason for a decision, but we cannot fully account for the underlying desires, fears, or inclinations that gave rise to that motive. Someone may say they chose a certain career for the sake of financial security, but they cannot rationally explain why financial stability holds greater importance for them than other potential life goals. These deeper motivational currents originate from what Schopenhauer would later term the will, while the principle of sufficient reason of acting helps us trace the surface-level links between motives and actions. It cannot penetrate to the unconscious source, the will, from which all motivation ultimately arises. This limitation underscores the necessity for a different mode of understanding, one that surpasses purely rational analysis. Schopenhauer's exploration of the four roots of the principle of sufficient reason revealed that this principle functions solely within the framework of representation. Each category of reasoning operates by linking one representation to another, following specific laws and structures. Causal reasoning links events in temporal sequence. Logical reasoning connects abstract concepts and propositions. Spatial and temporal reasoning associates physical locations and moments in time. And motivational reasoning links inner desires to outward actions. Yet, none of these forms of reasoning allow us to move beyond the domain of representation to access the thing in itself. They provide tools to interpret how representations are arranged and interrelated, but they fall short of explaining why representations exist in the first place, or what underlies the entire representational realm. To reach that level of explanation, one must gain direct access to reality as it is, independent of representational constructs. This realization became central to Schopenhauer's later philosophical work, as it both defined the boundaries of rational knowledge and pointed beyond them. Rational inquiry, regardless of its complexity or precision, remains confined within the sphere of representation. It is capable of dissecting, structuring, and anticipating phenomena as they appear, but it cannot escape the representational framework itself. The most profound questions, those concerning the nature of existence, the reality of suffering, and the possibility of liberation, cannot be fully resolved through rational thought alone. They demand a different kind of insight, one that transcends the principle of sufficient reason and apprehends reality directly. It is this immediate awareness of the will that forms the basis for aesthetic perception, moral comprehension, and ultimately the path to freedom from suffering. Part 7. Platonic Ideas and the Hierarchy of Objectification. Between the pure, undivided essence of the will and the multifaceted world of individual beings and objects, Schopenhauer identified a middle tier of reality he termed the Platonic ideas. Borrowing this notion from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, Schopenhauer regarded these ideas as timeless blueprints or archetypes through which the will takes shape in the phenomenal world. These ideas are central to Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory, offering a foundation for his belief that artistic genius has the power to move beyond surface appearances and perceive eternal truths. They also shed light on the apparent harmony, beauty, and purposeful structure of nature, which paradoxically arises from a will that is, in itself, blind and irrational. According to Schopenhauer, the Platonic ideas are the will's most direct objectifications. Unlike individual things, which appear to us through the filters of space, time, and causality imposed by human cognition, the ideas reflect the will's essence without mediation. While the world of particular objects involves indirect manifestation, filtered through the subject's ways of perceiving, the ideas stand as pure expressions of will. Each idea embodies a unique and unchanging mode of the will's expression, a foundational pattern that underlies all specific instances. For example, the idea of gravity is the eternal structure dictating how masses attract one another, manifesting identically in every gravitational event, from falling apples to planetary orbits. Similarly, the idea of the rose defines the universal pattern behind how roses grow, bloom, and reproduce. Every individual rose, no matter when or where it exists, is a concrete realization of this single, eternal idea. These ideas are not abstract generalizations invented by the human mind. Rather, they are objective realities that exist independently of our thoughts or perceptions. Unlike phenomena in the world of representation, which unfold within the bounds of space, time, and causality, the Platonic ideas transcend these conditions. They are immutable and eternal, unaffected by the constant changes that govern the realm of appearances. The idea of justice remains constant whether we examine it in ancient civilizations or modern legal systems. The idea of courage finds expression both in a medieval knight and a modern-day firefighter, regardless of their vastly different historical contexts. Because these ideas are beyond time and space, each individual instance fully embodies the whole idea rather than just a fragment. Every rose is a complete expression of the idea of the rose, not merely a partial representation. Schopenhauer arranged these ideas into a hierarchical system he called the grades of objectification, which range from the simplest forces of nature to the most sophisticated levels of consciousness. At the base of this hierarchy lie the basic physical forces, gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear interactions. These forces act with mechanical precision and without exception, representing the will in its most rudimentary form, pure, unconscious striving. A stone falling to the ground exemplifies the idea of gravity just as perfectly as the motion of planets in orbit. At this foundational level, the will manifests itself as natural law, establishing the framework within which more complex forms of existence can emerge. Above this level are the chemical forces, more intricate than the basic physical ones, because they involve selective interactions. These forces govern how specific elements attract or repel one another. For instance, water molecules form because hydrogen and oxygen atoms possess mutual affinities not shared with other elements. Here, the will begins to display the first signs of selectivity and differentiation, though it still lacks any form of consciousness or intentionality. Chemical processes show a more refined mode of objectification, hinting at complexity while remaining blind. The periodic table of elements serves as a comprehensive inventory of the various modes through which the will expresses itself at this level. Each element consistently exhibits its unique properties and behaviors wherever it occurs in the universe. At the top of the hierarchy lie the biological forces that shape and direct the behavior of living organisms. In this realm, the will manifests itself as the processes of life: growth, metabolism, reproduction, and the capacity to adapt to environmental challenges. Plants, in particular, mark a significant evolutionary leap beyond lifeless matter, as they display what appears to be purpose and intentionality in their behavior. A plant will orient itself toward a light source, send roots toward moisture and nutrients, and coordinate the activity of its parts to sustain health and propagate its species. Despite these purposeful actions, plants do not possess consciousness. They cannot form internal representations of the world or develop awareness of their own states. Their behavior reflects a more structured and dynamic expression of the will than what is found in inanimate matter, but their activity remains wholly unconscious, driven by instinctual mechanisms. Animal life embodies a more advanced stage of the will's expression, distinguished by the addition of conscious awareness and the ability to form mental representations. Unlike plants, animals perceive their surroundings, build internal models of objects and events, and alter their behavior through experience and learning. They display emotional states, pursue specific desires, and possess individual traits that set one apart from another. For example, a dog can identify its owner, recall where food is stored, and display feelings such as happiness, fear, or aggression, depending on the situation. Through consciousness, animals gain a more adaptive and intelligent means of interacting with their environment. However, this advancement also opens the door to new forms of suffering. An animal may crave what it cannot attain, recall painful events, or sense approaching danger, adding layers of emotional complexity to its existence. Among all known forms of life, human consciousness stands as the most elevated form of the will's manifestation. Humans not only share the full range of animal faculties, but also possess unique abilities such as abstract thinking, rational analysis, artistic creation, and philosophical reflection. Our awareness can move beyond the here and now, allowing us to envision unrealized possibilities and hypothetical scenarios. We have the capacity to plan future outcomes, learn from others' experiences, and construct sophisticated cultural systems that endure through time. Yet this heightened awareness comes with profound costs. No other being appears to experience the depth and constancy of suffering that humans do. Our ability to foresee difficulties, compare ourselves unfavorably with others, and imagine ideal lives we may never attain generates persistent dissatisfaction and existential distress. Schopenhauer maintained that each level of the will's objectification encompasses and builds upon those beneath it. Human beings, in this view, do not merely possess rational thought. They also embody the physical, chemical, and biological systems present in simpler forms of existence. We are subject to gravity just as any object is. Our cellular functions rely on biochemical interactions, and our organs perform the same essential life tasks seen in plants. Conscious awareness does not replace these lower mechanisms. It is layered on top of them. This layered structure makes human nature inherently conflicted. We are simultaneously influenced by the basic drives of our animalistic side and the abstract concerns unique to conscious thought. While we must address bodily needs like hunger or fatigue, we also wrestle with complex mental struggles that no other creature can imagine, questions of purpose, morality, and identity. At every level, the ideas that correspond to the will's various forms are locked in competition for the finite resources of matter and energy. This competition underlies the widespread conflict, struggle, and violence observable in the natural world. Species vie for food and territory, predators pursue prey, parasites exploit hosts. Even within a single organism, conflicting impulses arise. A human being might crave indulgent food while striving to maintain health, seek professional success, but long for family time, or chase thrilling experiences while fearing instability. Such internal contradictions emerge because the will, in its multifaceted self-expression, gives rise to competing tendencies, each making conflicting demands on the same individual existence. There is no ultimate authority capable of resolving these tensions once and for all. They are intrinsic to the very nature of existence. Schopenhauer, however, also understood that the essence of ideas exists in perfect harmony, beyond the constraints of space and time. Conflict only arises when these ideas take form within the realm of appearances, where individual beings are forced to contend with one another for scarce resources. In their timeless and unchanging state, the ideas are not antagonistic, but instead work in unison, each one enhancing and completing the others. Together, they create an integrated and comprehensive structure that reflects every possible expression of the will's manifestation. This understanding is crucial when considering aesthetic experience, those rare instances when consciousness lifts above the personal will and contemplates the pure essence of ideas themselves. During such moments, we are offered a vision of a reality untouched by rivalry, pain, or desire, a world where all forms exist in serene coexistence. This aesthetic awareness not only provides a brief respite from the turmoil of everyday existence, but also gestures toward a deeper form of freedom, one that may ultimately be attained through the full renunciation of the will itself. Part 8. The Essence of Human Suffering and the Roots of Pessimism. Arthur Schopenhauer produced one of the most comprehensive and unrelenting philosophical examinations of human suffering ever conceived. He asserted that suffering is not incidental, not merely a byproduct of circumstance, nor something that can be erased through progress in science or society. Rather, suffering is intrinsic to existence itself, a fundamental aspect of what it means to live. This suffering, he believed, arises inevitably from the core nature of the will and its expression through conscious beings. This conviction underpinned his philosophy of pessimism, the view that life, at its core, contains more anguish than joy, more disappointment than fulfillment, more conflict than tranquility. For Schopenhauer, the root of human suffering lies not in external conditions, but in the nature of willing itself. To will is, by definition, to long for what one lacks, to be driven toward a goal not yet realized. This drive is inherently tied to a sense of absence, of deficiency, of need. Hunger is the pain of lacking food. Loneliness is the ache of absent connection. Poverty is the suffering that comes from the absence of material means. All acts of willing originate from a state of negativity, a recognition that something essential is missing, and aim toward the positive outcome of obtaining the desired object or state. Yet, while this negative state is immediate and unmistakable, the satisfaction that follows is fleeting and uncertain. Schopenhauer noted that the vast majority of human life is spent in the condition of longing rather than fulfillment. We feel hunger more often than we experience the satisfaction of eating. We endure loneliness more than we bask in companionship. We worry about money more than we enjoy spending it. Even after we fulfill our basic needs, new wants and aspirations arise almost immediately, replacing the old ones and continuing the cycle. A person who achieves financial stability may soon begin to crave respect or fame. Someone who earns admiration may then hunger for power. One who finds love might quickly become preoccupied with the fear of losing it. The will continuously spawns new desires and ambitions, ensuring that life remains dominated by dissatisfaction and pursuit. And when gratification finally arrives, it is typically short-lived, quickly overtaken by yet another longing. Moreover, Schopenhauer believed that even these moments of gratification come with their own burdens. When our desires are fulfilled, we often realize that the reality does not match the idealized version we imagined. The dream job turns out to involve mundane or draining tasks that were not anticipated. The partner we once idealized reveals unexpected flaws once the excitement of courtship fades. The possessions we once longed for quickly become ordinary and cease to thrill or please us. Furthermore, reaching our goals can rob us of the sense of purpose that striving once provided. The chase often feels more meaningful and energizing than the achievement itself. Upon attaining success, many are haunted by a sense of emptiness, asking themselves, "What now?" This led Schopenhauer to liken human life to a pendulum swinging between two poles, desire and boredom. When we yearn for something we do not have, we suffer from longing. When we finally obtain it, we suffer from boredom. There is no lasting equilibrium, no steady ground on which we can experience enduring contentment. The will ensures that we are either yearning for what is absent or disillusioned by what is present. Even individuals who appear to have everything, celebrities, the wealthy, powerful leaders, are not immune to this dynamic. Many of them speak openly of their struggles with anxiety, depression, and a deep sense of meaninglessness. External achievements, no matter how impressive, cannot undo the internal machinery of the will that continually generates suffering. Schopenhauer also identified several additional mechanisms through which the will intensifies suffering. One of the most significant is its impact on how we perceive the world around us. Intense desire tends to distort perception. We highlight the appealing traits of what we want and downplay or ignore its drawbacks. We convince ourselves that achieving our goals will solve far more problems and bring far more happiness than is actually possible. This built-in distortion sets us up for inevitable disillusionment when reality fails to deliver on our inflated expectations. The same psychological process works in reverse when we fear or seek to avoid something. We magnify its negative features and underestimate our ability to handle it if it happens. In both desire and aversion, the will misguides our perception, leading us into unnecessary suffering, either through disappointment or anxiety. A significant source of human suffering stems from the inherently competitive nature of desire. Most of what we seek in life is limited, whether it's status, resources, recognition, or affection, which often means that one person's gain comes at another's expense. There are only so many top-tier roles to fill, only so many coveted possessions to acquire, and only so much attention and admiration others can give. This scarcity reshapes our view of those around us. Instead of allies, we see rivals. We may find ourselves wishing for the downfall of others so that we might rise, and feeling uneasy or threatened when others achieve what we ourselves long for. This dynamic leads us to experience jealousy when someone else secures something we desire. Desire drives us into a kind of perpetual competition that undermines our ability to maintain authentic friendship, mutual love, and lasting cooperation. Human relationships bring further complications, as described by Schopenhauer through the metaphor of the hedgehog's dilemma. Just as hedgehogs seek warmth by drawing close but hurt one another with their quills, people crave intimacy, yet often wound one another through that closeness. We long to be understood and supported by others, but we also demand space for our independence and personal identity. We wish to be loved for our true selves, yet at the same time we yearn for privacy and control over how others perceive us. These opposing desires make relationships inherently fragile, setting the stage for disappointment. We suffer in isolation, but prolonged closeness brings its own form of distress. Schopenhauer also explored how human consciousness intensifies suffering by stretching it across time. While animals primarily endure immediate physical pain, humans suffer across past, present, and future. We replay painful memories, anticipate future hardships, and are haunted by regrets over choices we didn't make. We revisit humiliations from long ago, obsess over distant career outcomes, and lament the lives we might have lived under different circumstances. Even someone who appears successful can be plagued by dissatisfaction, simply because they compare themselves to someone even more accomplished, or because they imagine how much better things could have been. Through consciousness, every small failure becomes a lasting source of anguish. Our capacity for reflection and imagination, while powerful, allows us to suffer from things that are neither present nor real, possibilities that never came to be. Moreover, abstract thinking gives rise to distinctively human forms of suffering, unlike anything animals endure. We wrestle with questions about the meaning of life, the inevitability of death, and the moral weight of our decisions. We construct ideals about how life should unfold, and then torment ourselves when life doesn't measure up. We invent complex worldviews, religious, political, philosophical, and suffer when they are challenged or dismissed by others. Animals may feel fear or hunger, but only humans experience guilt, shame, existential despair, and the sharp pain of unmet potential. The very mental faculties that enable us to create beauty, meaning, and progress also make us vulnerable to deeper and more intricate forms of suffering. Yet, Schopenhauer was not merely a prophet of despair. His intent was not to convince us that life is devoid of hope. Rather, he argued that facing the full depth and persistence of suffering was a necessary first step toward meaningful relief. Attempts to escape suffering often fail precisely because they are rooted in naive optimism, misunderstandings of human nature and of existence itself. These failed attempts assume that suffering arises from external circumstances we can control, instead of recognizing that it originates from the internal mechanisms of desire, mechanisms that can only be dismantled through a radical shift in consciousness. It is only when we understand why conventional paths to happiness are inherently flawed that we can begin to appreciate the alternative paths Schopenhauer illuminated. These include the transcendent moments found in art and aesthetic experience, the clarity that comes with ethical insight, and ultimately, the liberation found in renouncing the will to live. His philosophical pessimism was not a final verdict, but a critical diagnosis, a gateway to deeper healing and a more profound understanding of how we might live beyond suffering. Part 9. Genius, Talent, and Intellectual Capacity. Arthur Schopenhauer crafted a unique perspective on genius, linking exceptional intellectual and artistic prowess to an individual's rare ability to rise above the self-centered nature of ordinary consciousness. In his view, true genius is marked by the capacity to apprehend timeless, universal truths, what he termed eternal ideas, rather than being confined to fleeting personal concerns or material specifics. Those endowed with this extraordinary trait are able to produce profound works of art, literature, and philosophy that tap into the shared essence of human experience. These creations unveil layers of truth often obscured from the awareness of most individuals. For Schopenhauer, genius is not merely a matter of high IQ or refined technique, though these might be present, but is rooted in a distinct mode of awareness, one that can momentarily break free from the compulsions of personal desire and will. Such elevated perception, according to Schopenhauer, explains both the remarkable achievements and the emotional struggles that often accompany highly gifted individuals. His theory highlights how intellectual brilliance is frequently intertwined with deeper spiritual insight, and why true genius stands out as both exceptional and seldom understood. It also clarifies why society, grounded in more practical concerns, often fails to recognize or value this rare quality. At the heart of Schopenhauer's conception of genius is the ability to transcend personal interests and perceive enduring structures of reality. Most people relate to the world through the lens of personal advantage, attending to what serves their immediate needs, protects their interests, or furthers their goals. In doing so, they often overlook aspects of reality that do not serve any direct or utilitarian purpose. The genius, on the other hand, can become entirely immersed in the contemplation of an idea or object, losing awareness of themselves as individuals. In such moments, they are not thinking in terms of personal gain or loss. Instead, they grasp the deeper, organizing principles that shape whole categories of existence. This mental shift, from the personal to the universal, enables them to discern patterns and connections that remain hidden from minds focused on the practical and immediate. In the domain of artistic genius, this faculty manifests as the ability to recognize and convey the eternal forms underlying the transient world of specific events and objects. A truly great artist does not merely replicate what the eye sees. Rather, they reveal the archetypes, the universal forms, embodied in their subjects. A masterful portrait, for instance, does more than depict a single individual. It reveals enduring qualities such as dignity, sorrow, wisdom, or determination that transcend time and place. Likewise, a landscape painting by a gifted artist is not merely a snapshot of one location. It conveys the universal elements of nature, mountain, forest, sky, and river, in their most essential and timeless expression. The artistic genius is capable of looking past the surface to the underlying reality, offering us a vision of the world that speaks to something deeper and more lasting than our immediate concerns. This ability to reveal the universal through the particular allows great art to resonate across cultures and eras, because it touches upon the foundational structures of human perception and experience. It holds meaning far beyond the moment in which it was created. The genius of literature, in contrast, lies in its capacity to express universal truths through language, character, and narrative. Through the written word, literary masters expose the fundamental patterns that shape human thought, emotion, and moral development. Authors like Shakespeare and Dostoevsky craft characters who are both psychologically believable as individuals and emblematic of broader human types. When we encounter figures such as Hamlet, Lady Macbeth, or Raskolnikov, we see them as distinct individuals with unique stories. Yet, simultaneously, they mirror universal themes: ambition, guilt, existential doubt, and ethical conflict that echo within all of us. Such characters illuminate the internal struggles that define the human condition. Literature of this caliber not only offers aesthetic pleasure, but also serves as a mirror to our inner lives. It sheds light on subconscious drives and hidden motivations, bringing into the open what we often conceal from ourselves and others. In this way, literary genius fulfills both artistic and psychological roles. It creates beauty while deepening our self-awareness and enriching our moral understanding. Philosophical genius is marked by the rare ability to look beyond conventional beliefs and superficial appearances to uncover the underlying truths that shape reality. While most individuals accept the world as it is presented to them, adopting societal norms, values, and assumptions without question, true philosophical brilliance resists such complacency. It refuses to settle for second-hand wisdom or the unexamined habits of common sense. This kind of intellect is driven to confront the most profound questions concerning existence, knowledge, morality, and meaning. It follows these inquiries with unwavering integrity, regardless of the discomfort or uncertainty they might provoke. Thinkers such as Plato, Kant, and Schopenhauer exemplify this pursuit. Each developed radically new approaches to timeless problems that had either been overlooked or insufficiently explored. Such minds construct entirely new conceptual frameworks, shedding light on dimensions of human experience that were previously obscured or misunderstood. In doing so, they often reveal that widely accepted notions about the world are not only simplistic, but fundamentally flawed. However, Schopenhauer recognized that this level of insight comes at a steep personal price. Genius, in his view, involves a heightened awareness that is often ill-suited to the practical realities of everyday life. Those with this gift tend to immerse themselves in abstract contemplation, focused on universal truths rather than the typical pursuits of personal gain or social advancement. As a result, they frequently neglect aspects of life that others prioritize, such as health, financial stability, or personal relationships. Their capacity to question established norms also places them in opposition to societal institutions and cultural traditions that most accept uncritically. This resistance to conformity often leads to tension and alienation, whether with family, peers, or authority figures who may view innovation as a threat rather than a virtue. Moreover, the same refined sensitivity that enables genius to uncover profound truths and produce transcendent works also renders these individuals more susceptible to the painful aspects of existence. The intensity of their inner life often makes them acutely aware of suffering in a way others may not fully grasp. Schopenhauer also drew a sharp distinction between true genius and mere talent, though he acknowledged that the line between them is not always clear. Talent involves a high degree of skill in applying established techniques to achieve recognized goals within a defined system. For example, a talented musician might perform challenging compositions with technical mastery. A skilled scientist might carry out complex experiments and interpret data effectively. A capable writer might produce compelling narratives using well-known literary tools. However, talent functions within parameters already set by society and works toward aims that are commonly accepted and valued. Genius, by contrast, breaks free of these constraints. It forges entirely new paths, whether in thought, expression, or understanding, doing not merely what has been done well before, but what had previously seemed unimaginable. This fundamental difference helps explain why genuine genius is so often overlooked or even dismissed in its own time. Society is structured to recognize and reward talent because it supports goals that align with existing norms. Genius, on the other hand, disrupts those norms. It introduces ideas and creations that do not fit within established criteria and therefore cannot be properly judged by conventional standards. As a result, the contributions of genius may initially appear strange, unsettling, or irrelevant to contemporaries who lack the conceptual tools to grasp their importance. Only later, when new intellectual or cultural frameworks have emerged, does society begin to understand and appreciate what once seemed incomprehensible. This recurring pattern accounts for the posthumous recognition often granted to many of history's greatest philosophers, artists, and writers. While their more conventional peers may have enjoyed fame and approval during their lifetimes, the truly innovative minds were frequently celebrated only after their revolutionary insights had finally found fertile ground in a more receptive era. Schopenhauer explored the intricate connection between genius and madness, observing that both entailed departures from everyday awareness and typical social behavior. Yet, he emphasized that these two conditions diverge in fundamentally opposite directions from the standard mental state. Madness, in his view, is marked by an obsessive attachment to specific thoughts, memories, or sensations, which isolates the individual from the shared reality of others. Those suffering from madness become trapped in their inner world, unable to disengage from their compulsions in order to participate meaningfully in the objective world. Genius, on the other hand, reflects a remarkable capacity to rise above personal fixations and attain an impersonal, universal vantage point. The individual endowed with genius transcends subjective limitations and self-interest to perceive truths that hold relevance for all, even if such truths are not readily accessible to the average person. Though both madness and genius stand apart from conventional modes of social engagement, their trajectories differ. Madness leads deeper into subjective isolation, while genius ascends toward heightened objectivity. This crucial distinction accounts for the enduring contributions of genius, which yield works of lasting significance, whereas madness tends to result in disarray and suffering. The scarcity of true genius corresponds to the rarity of the profound shift in consciousness required to achieve such intellectual and creative breakthroughs. Most people live their entire lives confined within the narrow perspective of personal will, primarily concerned with fulfilling desires and safeguarding the ego. To momentarily step beyond this self-centered orientation and attain a pure, disinterested contemplation of universal truths demands an exceptional blend of cognitive brilliance, emotional detachment, and spiritual depth. This elevated mode of awareness, akin to what Schopenhauer described in aesthetic contemplation and moral awakening, must not only be reached but maintained over time and redirected toward artistic or philosophical creation. Thus, genuine genius is often linked with other forms of spiritual growth and may even prepare the way for the exceedingly rare attainment of complete will negation. The individual capable of leaving behind personal concerns to produce universally resonant works of art or thought has already made considerable progress toward the ultimate transcendence that Schopenhauer regarded as the highest potential of human existence. Part 10. Political Philosophy and Social Critique. Schopenhauer's political thought was a direct extension of his metaphysical view of human nature, namely, that individuals are fundamentally driven by a blind, ceaseless will to strive and compete. Contrary to those philosophers who believed that social ills could be remedied through institutional reform, improved education, or economic restructuring, Schopenhauer maintained that political strife and inequality are rooted in the very structure of human consciousness. He categorically rejected both the liberal belief in progress through rational deliberation and democratic engagement, and the socialist vision of justice achieved through radical economic change. Instead, he promoted a pragmatic approach to politics, one that acknowledged the limitations of human nature and aimed to reduce suffering and maintain social order without entertaining utopian illusions. While his outlook was conservative in its skepticism toward the perfectibility of human beings, it was also marked by a genuine humanitarian impulse. Schopenhauer sought not the eradication of suffering, which he deemed impossible, but its minimization. His political stance fused a deep pessimism about human motives with a sincere concern for alleviating harm, resulting in a unique position that resisted easy categorization within either progressive or reactionary ideologies. Though outside the political mainstream, his ideas would go on to influence later thinkers wrestling with similar themes. At the core of Schopenhauer's political analysis was the recognition that individuals are separate, self-interested centers of will, inevitably competing over limited resources and social advantages. While philosophical insight might disclose that this division is ultimately an illusion, most people never transcend the ego-bound perspective that defines their ordinary political existence. Driven by self-interest, individuals naturally prioritize their own needs, as well as those of their families, communities, and nations, often to the detriment of others pursuing similar goals. According to Schopenhauer, this unavoidable rivalry produces persistent conflict, which no amount of moral instruction or institutional innovation can fully resolve. Even those who intellectually grasp the value of cooperation and solidarity often falter when their own well-being or that of their loved ones, is at risk. The pressure of immediate self-interest tends to override abstract ethical commitments. For this reason, Schopenhauer argued that political systems must be grounded in an honest assessment of human nature, rather than shaped by idealistic theories about what people ought to be. This realistic outlook led him to favor constitutional monarchy as the most effective governmental structure for managing the inherent tensions of political life. In his view, placing ultimate authority in the hands of a single figure positioned above partisan divisions could foster stability and objective governance, qualities that democratic systems frequently lacked. However, he did not advocate for unchecked royal power. The monarch, Schopenhauer insisted, must be bound by constitutional constraints that safeguard individual rights and prevent authoritarian abuse. The optimal system, as he envisioned it, would merge the decisiveness and neutrality of monarchical rule with the civil protections offered by a robust constitutional framework. Schopenhauer was deeply skeptical of democracy. He believed it often devolved into a battleground of factions, each seeking to exploit state power for its own benefit rather than serving the public good. Majority rule, in this context, could easily become a tool for suppressing minority voices. Moreover, the inherently competitive character of democratic politics, he argued, tended to reward populism and opportunism over wisdom and integrity. He was particularly dismissive of the optimistic foundations upon which liberal and democratic theories were built. Enlightenment philosophers had posited that human progress could be achieved through education, rational discourse, and participatory governance. Schopenhauer, however, doubted that the general population possessed either the intellectual capability or the ethical resolve to engage in politics at such a level. In his estimation, most individuals were too absorbed in their own daily struggles to form educated opinions about complex political matters. And when they did hold political views, these were more often shaped by emotion, bias, and personal interest than by dispassionate reasoning or informed analysis. Democratic systems, in Schopenhauer's view, often elevated leaders who could skillfully manipulate public sentiment rather than those guided by wisdom or integrity. This tendency frequently resulted in governance that catered to the basest impulses of the majority rather than leadership by the most capable and enlightened individuals. Based on this assessment, Schopenhauer leaned toward political structures that centralized authority in the hands of educated elites, rather than dispersing power broadly among the general population. Despite this conservative stance, Schopenhauer's political thought was tempered by a deep humanitarian concern. He was skeptical that political action alone could create a society grounded in justice and harmony. Yet he firmly believed that the state bore responsibility for curbing unnecessary cruelty and ensuring the minimal conditions necessary for human well-being. He was a vocal advocate for civil liberties, strongly supporting the rights to free thought, expression, and religious belief. In matters of criminal justice, he emphasized compassion, arguing that punishment should aim to prevent future harm and rehabilitate offenders rather than exact vengeance. His ethical sensitivity extended beyond human affairs. He was especially disturbed by the mistreatment of animals and believed that legal protections should shield them from abuse and exploitation. This ethical commitment led Schopenhauer to endorse social measures designed to alleviate suffering, even as he remained doubtful that political systems could ever fully resolve the deeper issues underlying human misery. His economic perspective was similarly shaped by a broader pessimism regarding material progress as a path to human happiness. While he acknowledged that severe poverty imposed avoidable hardship and that society had a duty to meet its members' basic needs, he was unconvinced that increasing overall wealth would significantly lessen human suffering. To Schopenhauer, prosperity often bred new desires and rivalries rather than true contentment. Though wealth might eliminate certain hardships tied to lack, it frequently introduced fresh anxieties, heightened social competition, and a deeper sense of existential dissatisfaction. The human will, with its inherent tendency to generate unrest, was not constrained by external improvements. Even under materially favorable conditions, the will could produce new forms of discontent. This understanding led him to favor moderate economic reforms aimed at easing severe hardship, while remaining wary of the illusion that economic development alone could bring about a fundamentally better human condition. He was especially critical of socialist ideologies that promised to eradicate inequality and establish perfect justice through radical restructuring of economic relations. Although he sympathized with concerns about exploitation and unjust resource distribution, he doubted that altering economic systems could eliminate the underlying struggles born of human willing. According to Schopenhauer, socialist societies might redistribute wealth more equitably, but they would still grapple with tensions between individual aspirations and collective obligations. The same innate drives that caused problems under capitalism would merely resurface in new ways under socialism. Furthermore, the centralization of economic control required by socialism posed a serious risk of authoritarianism and the erosion of personal freedoms. In contrast, Schopenhauer favored regulated market economies, systems that combined individual freedom with protective measures for the vulnerable, over revolutionary programs that promised utopian equality at the cost of liberty and efficiency. His reflections on nationalism and global politics were likewise rooted in his understanding of the human will. He believed that strong identification with a nation, ethnic group, or religion often intensified the very conflicts it purported to resolve. Such affiliations, he warned, could lead people to rationalize cruelty and indifference toward outsiders, attitudes they would never accept within their own communities. Nationalistic fervor allowed individuals to cloak self-interest in the language of patriotism or religious devotion, recasting selfish motives as moral duties. In Schopenhauer's estimation, wars and international hostilities typically emerged not from logical disagreements, but from the collective expression of the will's inherently competitive nature. Although he conceded that some form of group loyalty was likely unavoidable due to human psychology, Schopenhauer championed international law and diplomacy as tools for mitigating the destructiveness of nationalist rivalries. He endorsed the creation of international bodies capable of mediating disputes and establishing common standards of decency and conduct among nations. Although Schopenhauer maintained a largely bleak outlook on the prospects of political reform, he held that philosophical understanding and inner spiritual growth could, over time, exert a softening influence on political dynamics. By diminishing the force of relentless striving and competition within at least some individuals, such insight might slowly elevate the tone of political life. Those who come to grasp the illusory nature of the self as a wholly separate entity may, in turn, become more genuinely empathetic and less bound by selfish motives. Individuals who have experienced the tranquility offered by profound aesthetic experiences or ethical awakening are less inclined to endorse policies rooted in resentment, vengeance, or exploitation. While such inner transformation would always remain the exception rather than the rule, even its rare occurrence might act as a quiet catalyst for positive change in both political leadership and public debate. A system of education that nurtures introspection and contemplative insight could do more to advance political progress than one devoted solely to practical skills or the reinforcement of rigid ideologies. Ultimately, Schopenhauer believed that the path to resolving political strife did not lie in constructing better institutions alone, but in fostering a deeper shift in consciousness, one that would reduce the grip of the will to compete, which lies at the root of most political conflict. Part 11. Influence and Legacy. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophical vision left a lasting mark not just on academic philosophy, but across a wide spectrum of cultural domains, shaping literature, music, psychology, and popular thought throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Though largely overlooked during his early years, his ideas eventually resonated with some of the most innovative and influential minds of the modern age. Writers, artists, composers, and intellectuals found in Schopenhauer's worldview a profound and nuanced framework for exploring the more troubling aspects of human existence, dimensions that the Enlightenment's optimistic rationalism had often sidelined. His penetrating examination of suffering, his understanding of unconscious impulses driving behavior, and his vision of transcendence through aesthetic experience and contemplation offered powerful conceptual tools for engaging with the turmoil and ambiguity of modern life. The breadth and intensity of Schopenhauer's influence testify to the enduring power of his central ideas. Even as later thinkers revised, critiqued, or extended his theories, the core of his philosophy remained a touchstone for generations seeking to understand the human condition. Recognizing this impact sheds light not only on his historical role, but also on the continued relevance of his thought in current discussions surrounding consciousness, purpose, and the pursuit of well-being. Among those most profoundly shaped by Schopenhauer was Friedrich Nietzsche, arguably his most significant philosophical successor. Yet their intellectual relationship was anything but straightforward. It was marked by deep influence, evolving engagement, and eventual divergence. As a young scholar, Nietzsche encountered the world as will and representation, and described the experience as transformative, calling it the most significant intellectual event of his life. Nietzsche absorbed Schopenhauer's idea that at its core, reality is driven by blind, irrational forces rather than governed by reason or divine design. He adopted the view that conscious thought merely scratches the surface of a far deeper, unconscious reality shaping human behavior. Nietzsche also aligned with Schopenhauer's critique of traditional morality, viewing it as often serving hidden agendas rather than the noble ideals it claimed to uphold. However, Nietzsche ultimately broke with Schopenhauer's grim assessment of life's value. While Schopenhauer urged withdrawal from the will through asceticism and denial as a path to peace, Nietzsche instead advocated for a bold affirmation of life. He saw the will to power, a dynamic, creative force underlying all action, not as a source of torment, but as the origin of human greatness, beauty, and meaning. Where Schopenhauer viewed the will as something to overcome, Nietzsche regarded it as a vital force to be embraced. His concepts of the Übermensch, Overman, and eternal recurrence exemplified a philosophy that celebrated existence in all its intensity. Nietzsche's thought can thus be seen as an extended critical dialogue with Schopenhauer, one that accepted many of his psychological insights while reimagining their ethical and existential implications. This engagement helped lay the groundwork for major currents in both existentialism and postmodern philosophy. Even those thinkers who rejected both Schopenhauer's pessimism and Nietzsche's radical affirmations found themselves grappling with questions that their debate had brought to the forefront of modern philosophy. Sigmund Freud, for instance, recognized Schopenhauer as a key forerunner to the development of psychoanalytic theory. In particular, Freud drew from Schopenhauer's ideas about unconscious motivation. Schopenhauer's exploration of how sexual desire operates beneath conscious awareness to influence choices and behavior prefigured many of Freud's own conclusions about the role of repressed sexuality in psychological life. Schopenhauer's recognition that conscious, rational thought often serves merely to justify deeper, unconscious impulses laid the groundwork for ideas that Freud would later systematize into his model of the id, ego, and superego. Schopenhauer's belief that personal identity is largely a mental construct and that consciousness is capable of extending beyond the confines of the ego played a crucial role in shaping Freud's view of psychoanalysis as a method for altering how individuals relate to their own hidden motivations. Whereas Schopenhauer regarded the unconscious will as something that should ultimately be overcome, Freud was more concerned with fostering harmony between conscious awareness and unconscious drives. This fundamental divergence reflects broader philosophical tensions regarding human fulfillment and the intended aims of therapeutic practice. Schopenhauer's influence is also deeply felt in the realm of aesthetics and modern artistic expression. Authors such as Thomas Mann, Marcel Proust, and Jorge Luis Borges drew from his philosophy an intricate understanding of art's potential to offer a respite from the burdens of everyday consciousness. His assertion that great art reveals timeless structures beneath the surface of transient events inspired literary methods that strive to illuminate universal truths through the depiction of specific moments, characters, and settings. The concept that deep aesthetic experience involves a temporary dissolution of the ego became central to modern theories of how individuals can be changed through meaningful encounters with works of art. This idea helped explain how art could move audiences by momentarily freeing them from their personal identities. Schopenhauer's treatment of music as the most immediate and powerful artistic representation of the will profoundly impacted both composers and theorists. His view suggested that instrumental music could communicate emotional and philosophical depth without the mediation of language or imagery. Richard Wagner, most notably, built upon this framework in developing his idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total artwork, drawing on Schopenhauer's notion of music as a direct conduit to the core of existence. Schopenhauer's early engagement with Indian and Buddhist philosophies played a pivotal role in legitimizing the Western study of Eastern thought, a trend that grew significantly during the 19th and 20th centuries. He was among the first prominent European thinkers to recognize the richness of Indian philosophical traditions and their potential to enhance Western modes of inquiry. By integrating Kant's idealism with Eastern ideas such as Maya and nirvana, Schopenhauer created a compelling example of how Western and Eastern philosophies could illuminate each other when brought into dialogue. This intellectual fusion not only influenced academic philosophy, but also contributed to the growing cultural interest in practices like meditation, mindfulness, and contemplative reflection that have become widespread today. Countless individuals engaged in yoga, meditation, or spiritual self-exploration are, often unknowingly, beneficiaries of the shift in Western consciousness that Schopenhauer helped initiate. His example of combining respect for Eastern spiritual insights with a commitment to rational philosophical analysis set a lasting precedent for contemporary discussions on spirituality, consciousness, and philosophical integration. The therapeutic relevance of Schopenhauer's thought extends far beyond Freud's psychoanalytic framework. His belief that suffering frequently stems from our clinging to desires that are inherently unsatisfiable has informed therapeutic models that prioritize acceptance over the mere pursuit of fulfillment. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy, with its focus on challenging and transforming irrational or maladaptive thought patterns rather than merely satisfying desires, echoes the philosophical insights Schopenhauer offered. Similarly, mindfulness-based approaches that train individuals to observe their mental and emotional states without being governed by them closely mirror his view of how awareness can transcend the habitual activity of the will. Schopenhauer's emphasis on compassion as a natural consequence of recognizing our deep interconnection with others has influenced therapeutic methods that highlight empathy, kindness toward the self, and the erosion of rigid boundaries between the self and others. Even therapists unfamiliar with his writings often implement strategies grounded in his ideas about the nature of suffering and the paths toward its alleviation. Current explorations of consciousness, meaning, and well-being continue to wrestle with the very questions that Schopenhauer addressed with exceptional depth and intellectual clarity. His proposition that consciousness holds primacy over the physical phenomena associated with it remains central to present-day dialogues on the mind-body dilemma and the essence of subjective awareness. His reflections on why material wealth often fails to yield lasting contentment resonate profoundly with modern anxieties surrounding depression, psychological distress, and the sense of purposelessness that pervades affluent societies. Schopenhauer's recognition that the suffering produced by competitive individualism cannot be alleviated merely through improved external conditions continues to shape conversations on social reform and political philosophy. Moreover, his advocacy for transcendence through art, moral awakening, and meditative practice presents a compelling alternative to both consumer-driven values and rigid religious dogma, an alternative that increasingly appeals to those disillusioned with both extremes. By showing how philosophical inquiry and spiritual growth can enrich rather than oppose one another, Schopenhauer offers a framework for confronting life's deepest questions with both intellectual depth and contemplative sensitivity. Above all, his unwavering acknowledgement of suffering as an inescapable part of human existence and his determined effort to find meaningful responses to it remain profoundly influential for those who reject superficial platitudes and empty reassurances. In a cultural climate that often encourages hollow positivity and consumer-oriented solutions to dissatisfaction, his demand that we confront suffering honestly before seeking to transcend it remains not only provocative, but profoundly relevant. Schopenhauer's argument that the highest forms of human flourishing require a shift beyond self-centered consciousness toward universal empathy and wisdom, continues to offer a compelling vision of personal and collective growth. While the total negation of the will, which he viewed as the ultimate spiritual aim, may lie beyond the reach of most, his insights into the incremental progress toward that state still provide valuable direction for those striving for greater inner clarity and peace. The continued relevance and influence of his work underscore the lasting significance of a philosophy that unites analytical precision with existential seriousness, clear reasoning with spiritual insight, and stark realism with a compassionate heart. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophical contributions endure as a powerful light cast on the fundamental dilemmas of human life, offering both profound understanding and practical guidance for navigating the complexities of conscious existence. Part 12. The Illusion of Individuality in Maya. One of the most profound and revolutionary ideas in Schopenhauer's philosophy is his assertion that individual existence is ultimately an illusion. He believed that our everyday experience of ourselves as distinct, self-contained individuals, separate from others, is not a reflection of reality, but a deception rooted in how our minds filter and structure our perception of the world. This illusion, which he referred to using the Sanskrit word Maya, is far more than a metaphysical abstraction. For Schopenhauer, it is the central source of human suffering and the key obstacle to true ethical understanding and spiritual liberation. He regarded the recognition and eventual dissolution of this illusion as vital to human transformation. According to Schopenhauer, the illusion of individuality originates from the basic cognitive frameworks, space, time, and causality, that the human mind automatically applies to all experience. Drawing on Kantian philosophy, he argued that these forms are not features of reality itself, but mental templates through which we interpret the world. They compel us to perceive the universe as divided into countless separate entities existing in various places, persisting through time, and interacting through cause and effect. When you look around, you instinctively distinguish tables, chairs, people, and walls as individual, bounded objects. Each appears to occupy its own unique place, existing independently of everything else. This way of experiencing the world is so fundamental and immediate that it's nearly impossible to imagine an alternative. And yet, Schopenhauer maintained that this entire framework of separation and multiplicity belongs only to the realm of appearances. It is not reflective of the deeper, truer nature of reality. Behind the illusion cast by Maya lies a state of existence that is wholly unified, timeless, and devoid of personal distinctions. At the most fundamental level, Schopenhauer argued, there exists only one will, an all-encompassing metaphysical force expressing itself through the myriad forms we perceive. What we interpret as our individual will, or the will of another, is merely a fragmentary appearance of this single underlying essence. The seeming distinctions between people, between subject and object, are not ontologically real. They are conceptual tools that serve practical functions, but do not reveal the true nature of existence. When one person inflicts harm on another, they are, in effect, harming themselves, though the illusion of separateness conceals this fact. Similarly, when individuals compete for limited resources, it amounts to an internal conflict within the one will, a kind of metaphysical civil war. Schopenhauer found strong affirmation of this insight in the ancient philosophical systems of India, especially in the Upanishads and Buddhist teachings. These traditions had long maintained that the self, as we usually conceive it, is an illusion, and that true enlightenment comes from recognizing the essential unity beneath the apparent diversity of existence. The Hindu idea of Atman, the true self that is identical in all beings, resonates closely with Schopenhauer's concept of the will as the inner reality of all things. Likewise, the Buddhist doctrine of Anatman, or no self, parallels his belief that personal identity is a transient construction rather than a lasting truth. Schopenhauer was among the first major Western thinkers to take these Eastern philosophies seriously and to synthesize them with the tools and rigor of European thought. He saw his philosophical conclusions not as new revelations, but as reasoned confirmations of spiritual truths long understood in the East. Schopenhauer also examined the specific cognitive mechanisms through which the illusion of individuality is maintained. One such mechanism is the mental form of space, which causes us to perceive objects and beings as existing in distinct locations, each with defined boundaries. Yet space, he argued, is not a thing that exists independently, like a container holding separate objects. Instead, it is a structural feature of consciousness, a way in which the unified will must appear to a perceiving mind. The will itself is not confined to any place or object. It is the inner essence of all phenomena, everywhere. However, when the will is filtered through consciousness, it necessarily takes on spatial form. It manifests as distinct shapes, sizes, and locations, thereby giving rise to the illusion of separateness and plurality. But this division is not real. It is a product of how we experience reality, not what reality truly is. Second, time functions as a framework that gives rise to the illusion that distinct beings possess separate lives, experiences, and destinies. It creates the sense that your life is a unique sequence of events, forming your identity and differentiating your story from everyone else's. Within this temporal framework, you appear to enter the world at a specific moment, grow through the stages of youth and maturity, make choices that carve out the trajectory of your adult life, and eventually encounter death as the final chapter of your individual existence. Yet Schopenhauer contended that this entire narrative structure belongs solely to the world as it is perceived. The will, in contrast, exists beyond the confines of time. It is eternal, unchanging, and untouched by birth or death. What seems like your beginning is merely the will-taking expression through a particular physical form, and what seems like your end is simply the will withdrawing from that form and continuing its expression through countless others. Third, causality shapes the illusion that individuals are distinct agents with separate powers, capable of influencing each other from the outside. You appear to act freely, making choices that alter your surroundings. Others seem like autonomous entities whose actions can either support or hinder you, accept or reject you, based on their own will and intentions. However, from Schopenhauer's perspective, every seemingly independent actor is in fact just a different expression of the same underlying will. When someone offers kindness to another, it is the will extending kindness to itself. When one person inflicts harm, it is the will harming itself. Every encounter, whether it involves conflict, cooperation, or reconciliation, is, in truth, a single will engaging with itself through the illusion of multiplicity. This insight into the fictitious nature of individual identity has deep practical consequences for how we understand suffering, ethics, and the path to liberation. Most suffering originates in the ego's effort to assert and preserve its separateness in competition with other perceived egos. We experience pain when our desires go unmet, when our personal ambitions are blocked, when our sense of self is challenged or attacked. But if the very notion of a separate self is a misunderstanding, an illusion generated by how consciousness structures experience, then this entire edifice of ego-based suffering stands on false ground. The self that suffers is not our essential being. It is a fleeting construct, one that arises from the mind's way of organizing the world. Recognizing this doesn't instantly dissolve pain, but it unveils suffering as less absolute and inevitable than it once seemed. Likewise, ethical behavior arises more effortlessly and intuitively once the illusion of separateness is seen through. Traditional moral systems often rely on commandments, duties, or consequences to persuade people to act justly, despite the clash of apparent self-interests. But if the boundary between self and other is ultimately false, then harming another is, in effect, harming oneself, even from a purely self-interested point of view. Compassion naturally arises when we perceive others as expressions of the same will that animates our own being. Just as we don't require rational arguments to care about our own welfare, we no longer need complex moral justifications to care for others. Once we grasp that they are not truly other in any fundamental sense, ethical conduct then becomes an organic outgrowth of understanding, rather than a duty imposed by external rules or societal pressures. The belief in individuality helps explain why most pursuits of happiness and fulfillment often end in disappointment. The ego attempts to find contentment by collecting possessions, accomplishments, relationships, and experiences, anything that might strengthen its sense of separateness and set it apart from others. But because the ego itself is a fabrication, efforts to satisfy it are as futile as trying to nourish a mirage. No matter how much external success one accumulates, it cannot provide enduring contentment to something that has no independent existence. This is why even those who seem to have it all frequently admit to feelings of emptiness, unease, and discontent. In reality, they have been striving to gratify a phantom. And phantoms, no matter how much praise or validation they receive, can never truly be fulfilled. Schopenhauer pointed out that merely recognizing the illusory nature of the self on an intellectual level is not enough to dismantle that illusion in lived experience. The mental frameworks of space, time, and causality continue to function automatically and subconsciously in ordinary states of awareness. As a result, even when we accept the non-reality of the individual self on a rational level, we still perceive ourselves as separate entities in daily life. To dissolve this illusion, one must enter uncommon states of consciousness that momentarily override or transcend these default cognitive structures. Such states can be reached through deep aesthetic absorption, genuine empathy, and identification with others, or ultimately through the radical renunciation of the will to live. Each of these pathways offers a fleeting glimpse beyond the veil of Maya, revealing the deeper unity that constitutes our true essence, though full and lasting freedom from the illusion remains exceedingly rare. Part 13. Art and the Aesthetic Experience. Art was the gateway through which Schopenhauer first discovered a powerful insight. Human consciousness can momentarily escape the grip of personal desire and catch a glimpse of the deeper reality that lies beyond the illusion of the world, which he called Maya. He went on to construct one of the most detailed and influential aesthetic theories in modern philosophy, contending that true artistic experience enables us to transcend our normal, ego-centered awareness. According to Schopenhauer, during moments of genuine aesthetic engagement, we enter a state of pure, detached contemplation. In these rare instances, we are able to step outside the confines of our individual selves, with all their anxieties, ambitions, and cravings, and become what he referred to as pure subjects of knowledge. This shift not only offers immediate relief from the suffering of our daily lives, but also provides a glimpse of the deeper liberation that comes through the total negation of the will. Aesthetic awareness is triggered when we come into contact with something truly beautiful, an object or scene that so captivates our attention that everything else fades from view, including our own sense of separate selfhood. This can occur while gazing at a masterful painting, listening to a stirring symphony, reading profound poetry, or simply witnessing the majesty of nature. In such moments, the usual flow of thoughts, concerns, ambitions, and emotional entanglements falls silent. We stop thinking about our personal struggles, aspirations, or social relationships. Instead, we become entirely immersed in the pure perception of the beautiful form before us. Time seems to lose its grip, and the clear boundary between observer and observed begins to dissolve. This state brings with it a deep sense of tranquility and completeness, a feeling of fulfillment that wants nothing, lacks nothing, and seeks nothing further. As Schopenhauer explained, in these rare intervals of aesthetic contemplation, the nature of our consciousness is radically altered. We cease to see isolated objects moving through space and time in causal chains. Instead, we perceive the eternal ideas, the timeless essences that those particular objects merely represent. For example, when we look at a rose through the lens of aesthetic awareness, we're not just seeing a fleeting blossom destined to fade. We are beholding the eternal form of the rose, the ideal pattern that is instantiated in every rose across time and place. Because these ideas exist beyond the limits of space, time, and causality, our aesthetic experiences feel timeless and universal, standing apart from the transient flow of ordinary perception. In such moments, we intuitively sense that what we are perceiving is not limited to a specific moment or location. It holds true for all time and in every place. Likewise, the transformation in our consciousness is just as profound. We are no longer the individual selves bound by personal narratives, specific goals, or distinct identities. Instead, we become universal subjects of pure knowing, consciousness stripped of all personal markings or limitations. This pure mode of awareness is identical in everyone who undergoes aesthetic contemplation. That's why great works of art speak across the divides of culture, language, and historical era. The consciousness that finds beauty in a medieval cathedral is the same as that which responds to a modern sculpture. The individuals having these experiences may be vastly different in every conceivable way, but the awareness itself, the essence of aesthetic perception, is one and the same. In revealing this shared core of experience, aesthetic contemplation uncovers the universal foundation of consciousness beneath all superficial differences. Schopenhauer believed that each art form provides access to distinct levels of reality, offering different kinds of aesthetic insight into the nature of existence. At the most foundational level stands architecture, which he viewed as the expression of the will in its simplest, most physical form. It embodies the basic forces of nature: gravity, resistance, and cohesion. A well-designed building brings to light the eternal principles that govern the behavior of matter under pressure, support, and weight. When we admire architectural beauty, we are intuitively grasping the abstract, mathematical relationships that regulate physical forces. Take Gothic cathedrals, for example. These immense stone structures manifest invisible dynamics of thrust and counterforce, achieving a balance that seems almost miraculous. This interplay of structure and force invites awe at the deeper order underlying the material world. In contrast, sculpture and painting engage with more developed manifestations of the will by depicting life forms, particularly human beings. Exceptional sculpture distills timeless archetypes that recur throughout history: the hero, the wise man, the mother, the lover, the warrior. When we behold a great statue, we see more than the physical likeness of a specific model. We perceive a universal human form that transcends the individual. Likewise, great paintings reveal the inner truths of emotion, connection, and human experience that surpass historical and cultural boundaries. A Renaissance depiction of the Madonna and Child, for instance, speaks to enduring themes of maternal love and spiritual devotion that are as powerful today as they were centuries ago. Through these visual arts, we are guided beyond superficial appearances toward the enduring structures that shape human nature itself. Poetry and literature, meanwhile, employ language and abstract thought to reveal dimensions of truth that visual art cannot express. Masterful poetry captures profound emotional and philosophical truths in words that resonate with the core of human experience. When we read such poetry, we often find our own unspoken feelings reflected back to us, our insights into love, grief, beauty, death, and purpose, given form and language for the first time. Literature delves into the depths of human character and social interaction, uncovering the recurring patterns of fate and personality that help us better understand ourselves. The finest literary works, such as the dramas of Shakespeare or the novels of Dostoevsky, expose the constants of human nature that remain unchanged despite the shifting currents of history and culture. These works help us recognize what is universal and enduring beneath the surface of our personal and social circumstances. Yet among all the arts, Schopenhauer held music in the highest regard. He saw it as the most immediate and potent of all artistic expressions. Unlike visual or literary arts, music does not depict specific objects or convey explicit ideas. Instead, it bypasses the need for representation and connects us directly to the will itself. In listening to a powerful composition, we encounter the raw essence of existence, its striving, tension, fulfillment, and release. Music gives voice to the elemental emotions and life forces at the heart of all awareness: longing, joy, sorrow, struggle, resolution. It touches us so deeply because it mirrors the rhythm of life itself, even when we cannot explain why a particular piece moves us. Each component of music symbolizes a different level of the will's unfolding. The bass line anchors the composition, representing the primal forces that form the foundation of existence. The inner harmonies suggest the organic world, the realm of plants and animals, adding texture and motion while supporting the whole. The melody, by contrast, embodies human consciousness, with its capacity for emotional depth and individual expression. The interplay among these layers mirrors the structure of nature itself, where various forms of being coexist in conflict and harmony within a grand cosmic process. Music, in this view, reveals the blueprint of reality, not through concepts or imagery, but through an immediate and intuitive experience of form and feeling. Aesthetic experience offers a real, though fleeting, respite from the suffering that typically defines our everyday awareness. In those rare moments of pure observation, we are freed from the grip of personal longing, released from anxiety about the future, and unburdened by comparisons with others. We find ourselves immersed in a deep, self-sufficient tranquility that asks for nothing beyond itself. This sense of peace doesn't arise from fulfilling our desires, but rather from stepping outside the very framework of desire altogether. In the state of aesthetic awareness, we momentarily escape the relentless pressure of unmet needs and unsatisfied wants. It reveals a brief but powerful vision of what it could mean to be free from the compulsions of individual striving. Yet, as Schopenhauer insisted, no matter how deep or moving, aesthetic experience remains impermanent and partial. Inevitably, we must return from this contemplative state to the ordinary world, where practical concerns and personal struggles once again take hold. The person lost in the beauty of a painting will, sooner or later, feel the pangs of hunger. The one who finds solace in music will eventually recall their anxieties. Aesthetic experience gestures toward a deeper liberation, but it cannot by itself offer lasting freedom from the cycle of craving and suffering. Achieving such liberation, according to Schopenhauer, requires a more radical shift in consciousness, one found through ethical insight and ultimately through the renunciation of the will to live. Still, aesthetic experience holds intrinsic worth, not only for the peace it brings in the moment, but also for the way it prepares us for more profound forms of release. Part 14. Ethics and Compassion. Schopenhauer's ethical thought stems directly from his metaphysical belief that individuality is ultimately an illusion. If all living beings are merely different expressions of a single, underlying will, then the rationale for ethical conduct becomes immediately evident. To harm another is, in essence, to harm oneself. Compassion, in Schopenhauer's view, should not be practiced out of moral obligation, religious commandment, or societal expectation. Rather, it emerges naturally when one perceives beyond the illusion of separateness, what he calls the veil of Maya, and realizes that others share the same essential being. True morality arises not from external codes, divine edicts, or social norms, but from an awakened understanding of the interconnectedness of all life. This perspective renders Schopenhauer's moral philosophy both more grounded in human nature and more radical than conventional ethical systems. At the heart of all authentic morality, according to Schopenhauer, lies an immediate, intuitive awareness that another's suffering is just as real and pressing as one's own. This awareness does not come through theoretical reasoning or intellectual debate. No amount of rational persuasion or threats of punishment can truly instill compassion in someone. Instead, compassion is born in those rare and profound moments when the boundary between self and other dissolves. In such instances, we do not think in terms of "why should I care?" any more than we question why we care about our own well-being. The concern for others arises spontaneously, unbidden, and with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. This response is instinctive, immediate, and irrefutable because the illusion of separateness, which typically obstructs compassion, has momentarily vanished. From this deeply felt compassion, Schopenhauer identifies two core virtues, justice and loving kindness. Justice is the natural outcome of understanding that another's pain is equivalent to one's own. When we fully grasp that another's suffering is just as real as our personal distress, the desire to cause harm fades away. We no longer need to be told not to hurt others. We simply lose the will to do so, recognizing that inflicting pain on others is, in effect, self-inflicted harm. For someone who reaches this level of awareness, fairness is not a matter of moral compliance, but a logical consequence of their expanded perspective. Once the illusion of separation is dispelled, the appeal of injustice, exploitation, or cruelty disappears entirely. Loving kindness, meanwhile, extends beyond mere non-harm. It involves active compassion, a desire to alleviate suffering and contribute positively to the lives of others. While justice prevents us from doing harm, loving kindness inspires us to do good. A person who sees others as reflections of their own true nature is naturally inclined to care for them, just as they would care for themselves. Their motivation to help is not driven by fear of punishment or hope for reward, but by the recognition that the joy and well-being of others enhance the overall well-being of the single, unified will that they too embody. What looks like self-sacrifice is, in truth, a form of enlightened self-interest, an altruism that arises from the dissolution of the false divide between self and other. Such generosity, though it appears selfless, is in fact the expression of a deeper awareness that all beings are part of one and the same essence, and that the happiness of others is inseparable from one's own. Schopenhauer believed that traditional ethical systems are fundamentally flawed because they attempt to inspire moral behavior through external incentives rather than fostering an inner transformation of awareness. In religious frameworks, moral conduct is typically motivated by the promise of heavenly rewards or the threat of eternal punishment. In contrast, utilitarian ethics promotes the idea that we should aim to increase overall happiness, claiming that doing so results in the most favorable outcomes for society. From the Kantian perspective, morality stems from our rational obligation to treat others with dignity and respect, independent of our personal preferences or desires. Although these differing approaches present unique arguments, they share a common assumption that moral behavior demands we act contrary to our natural self-interest in service of some external ideal or authority. Schopenhauer, however, rejected this premise. He maintained that genuine morality cannot arise from external pressures or promises because such influences do not dismantle the core structure of egoism. A person who performs good deeds solely to earn a place in heaven remains essentially self-centered. Only now their selfishness is projected across a broader timescale, guided by a deeper calculation of personal benefit. Likewise, someone who sacrifices their own well-being to serve the collective happiness of society might be seen as a moral exemplar. Yet this type of heroism is exceptionally rare and difficult to maintain over time. Similarly, when someone adheres to moral rules purely out of rational obligation, as in Kantian ethics, they must constantly restrain their natural inclinations through sheer willpower. This creates a persistent internal conflict between ethical duty and personal desire, rendering moral life exhausting, unnatural, and ultimately unstable. According to Schopenhauer, ethical conduct becomes authentic, sustainable, and instinctive only when the illusion of separateness, the sense that each individual is fundamentally isolated, dissolves. When compassion arises from a direct insight into the illusory nature of separateness, it no longer requires external justification. Instead, it flows effortlessly from our deepest nature, rather than standing in opposition to it. This insight, rooted in Schopenhauer's metaphysical worldview, informed his revolutionary stance on ethics. Indeed, Schopenhauer was among the first Western philosophers to seriously advocate for the moral consideration of animals and the natural world. If compassion is to be extended to all beings capable of suffering, then drawing arbitrary lines at the boundaries of our species becomes indefensible. Animals experience pain, fear, hunger, and frustration just as humans do, and it is this shared capacity for suffering that grants them an equal claim to moral regard. That animals cannot reason abstractly or create elaborate cultural systems does nothing to diminish the reality or importance of their suffering. For someone who has pierced through the illusion of separateness, all sentient beings appear as expressions of the same underlying will that animates their own existence. As this realization deepens, compassion naturally broadens to include every creature capable of longing, fulfillment, and frustration, the core dynamics of the will itself. Schopenhauer's expansion of moral concern was considered radical in his time and continues to challenge conventional thinking today. Most people find it relatively easy to empathize with fellow humans, particularly those who share similar appearances, values, or social backgrounds. But cultivating sincere compassion for individuals who differ greatly from us requires deeper understanding and moral maturity. To extend that same compassion to non-human animals demands an even greater transcendence of the ego's innate boundaries and preferences. Still, Schopenhauer contended that the ability to feel authentic concern for animals is a more reliable sign of ethical advancement than conventional standards of moral behavior. A person who can perceive the reality of animal suffering, he argued, has moved beyond the constraints of social norms and cultural biases, and has achieved a profound level of ethical insight. Schopenhauer was acutely aware that authentic compassion must not be confused with sentimentality or emotional posturing. While some individuals profess deep concern for others, their expressions of care often serve self-serving ends, subtly manipulating situations to benefit themselves. Others react strongly to the suffering around them, but these responses frequently center more on showcasing their own moral sensitivity than on alleviating the distress of those who are truly in need. Rather than taking effective action, such emotional displays can become a form of self-indulgence. For Schopenhauer, genuine compassion is not measured by how dramatically one feels, but by how constructively one acts. Truly compassionate individuals direct their attention toward discerning the actual needs of others and seeking concrete, realistic ways to meet them. Their focus lies in alleviating suffering, not in performing virtue or earning moral acclaim. Those who embody true compassion offer help quietly and effectively, without seeking applause or expecting thanks. Their concern is rooted in empathy, not ego. This deeper ethical understanding, one that comes from seeing through the illusion of individual separateness, what Schopenhauer referred to as Maya, also reshapes how we think about justice, punishment, and the structures of society. When we recognize that the self is not ultimately distinct from others, the craving for revenge against those who have harmed us loses much of its appeal. While we still acknowledge the importance of preventing harm and upholding social stability, the urge to retaliate becomes less justifiable. Once we grasp that all suffering is part of a shared, underlying reality, the drive to inflict pain in return for pain appears hollow. Punishment, then, is reframed, not as a moral imperative to restore balance to some cosmic scale, but as a practical tool for preserving social harmony. This shift in perspective fosters a justice system that is more functional and less rooted in vengeance. Despite this ideal, Schopenhauer recognized that the kind of insight required for genuine, unforced compassion is exceedingly rare. Most people live their entire lives caught in the illusion of separateness, treating others kindly only when they see a clear personal advantage in doing so. Even those who intellectually grasp the idea that individuality is an illusion typically continue to experience themselves as isolated selves in daily life. The dissolution of the boundaries between self and other, an experience central to true compassion, cannot be summoned at will. It arises, if at all, through rare moments of grace or sudden clarity. Because this level of awareness is so uncommon, conventional moral frameworks, with their emphasis on rules, punishments, and social expectations, remain essential for maintaining order. Yet, Schopenhauer urged us to see these systems not as the final word on morality, but as temporary measures, pragmatic tools rather than ultimate truths about human ethics. Part 15. The Renunciation of the Will to Live. In Schopenhauer's philosophy, the highest stage of human development and the ultimate answer to the problem of suffering is found in the complete renunciation of the will to live. This denial is not a minor adjustment or a change in priorities, but a profound and total transformation of consciousness, the most radical shift a person can undergo. It signifies a state where the individual ceases to experience any personal desires, ambitions, or attachment to life itself. Importantly, Schopenhauer did not equate this with suicide. In fact, he viewed suicide as a deep misunderstanding of the nature of suffering, an act that, rather than rejecting the will, paradoxically affirms it. Suicide violently rejects the conditions of life, but still clings to the hope for a different or better form of existence. True denial of the will is a gradual inward process marked by a complete fading of interest in the usual drivers of human behavior: pleasure, comfort, social status, personal relationships, and even survival. This profound shift marks the most complete form of liberation from suffering, a state comparable to nirvana or salvation, though Schopenhauer acknowledged that only a few rare individuals in history had ever fully attained it. The process often begins with a deep personal insight into the nature of life and the inherent futility of striving. Such a person sees with clarity that all willing leads inevitably to suffering, that fulfillment is fleeting, and that the sense of a stable, individual self is ultimately a delusion. With this understanding, the motivation to pursue goals that once seemed meaningful begins to fade. They come to realize that achieving their desires cannot bring lasting contentment, that ambition only gives rise to further ambition, and that defending the ego against imagined threats and competitors is an endless and futile struggle. This realization is not just a matter of abstract reasoning. It penetrates deeply into their lived experience, changing how they relate to their own wants and impulses. What once felt vital and urgent now seems empty, like a game whose rules no longer matter. Though desires may still arise, they no longer command the person's actions, as their underlying futility has been unmasked. As this inner transformation deepens, the person's connection to their own body and its needs begins to shift as well. They continue to care for their basic physical needs, eating when hungry, sleeping when tired, but without the usual emotional investment or anxious attachment to comfort and security. These acts become mechanical necessities rather than sources of gratification or meaning. Sexual desire, which Schopenhauer viewed as the most powerful expression of the will to live, begins to fade and often disappears entirely. This is not the result of repression or moral discipline, but rather a spontaneous and natural consequence of the will turning away from life. The person may live in celibacy, but not through effort. Rather, celibacy arises effortlessly as sexual motivation dissolves on its own. In parallel, their relationships with others are also transformed. As the will is denied more completely, the drive to compete for recognition, wealth, or social standing vanishes. No longer identifying with the personal ego that once sought these rewards, the person becomes genuinely unconcerned with praise or criticism, success or failure, admiration or disapproval. This detachment is not the product of emotional coldness or social withdrawal, but reflects a profound inner peace. It is the peace of someone who no longer needs anything from the social world to feel whole. Though they may still engage with others and offer help when appropriate, they do so without personal agenda or expectation. Their compassion becomes purely selfless, not because they are trying to be virtuous, but because the self that once stood to benefit from compassionate action has dissolved. When someone has completely rejected the will to live, material possessions and outward accomplishments lose all significance. They may still make use of life's essentials for practical reasons, but the desire to accumulate wealth, status, or impressive achievements no longer brings any sense of fulfillment. They come to see the pursuit of ego through external means as futile, akin to trying to rearrange the scenery in a dream to improve the dream itself. Because the ego is ultimately a fiction, any attempt to serve its interests is equally illusory. Recognizing this leads to a profound simplification of life, accompanied by a genuine disinterest in the pursuits that typically dominate people's ambitions and daily routines. Such a person lives simply not out of ethical obligation, but because the appeal of luxury and complexity has completely dissolved. As the renunciation of the will deepens, even the instinct for self-preservation begins to diminish. The person does not actively seek out death, but they no longer cling to life with the urgency or fear that drives most people. There arises a true indifference to whether they live or die, not from despair or suicidal ideation, but from having seen through the illusion that makes personal survival seem inherently meaningful. If confronted by illness or danger, they may act with basic caution, but without panic or the desperate drive to survive. Death is viewed as just another possible occurrence, neither feared nor sought, no more significant than any other transformation in the realm of appearances. This detachment from the need to survive marks the highest level of transcendence over the ego's deepest concern. Schopenhauer identified this complete denial of the will in the lives of certain Christian saints and Eastern mystics, those who had reached extraordinary levels of spiritual realization. These individuals did not renounce worldly pleasure and ambition as acts of moral heroism, but because such things had lost all relevance. Their celibacy, poverty, and retreat from society were not burdensome sacrifices, but natural expressions of a radical inner transformation. They did not battle against desire, they had simply ceased to desire. Their ascetic lifestyle was not an act of repression, but a reflection of an internal state where the cravings that such practices typically resist had already vanished. They endured suffering without protest, having ceased to identify with the self that suffers. They met death with peace, having already transcended the ego that fears its end. Their lives stood as proof that total liberation from the will to live is indeed possible, even if extraordinarily rare. Still, Schopenhauer cautioned that this denial of the will is not something one can actively chase or enforce. To try to eliminate desire through effort or self-discipline only reaffirms the will itself. The very act of struggling against desire is fueled by another form of desire, the wish to be free of it. This creates an inherent contradiction that cannot be resolved by sheer willpower or determination. Genuine renunciation arises not from effort, but from a deep, spontaneous insight, a clarity so absolute that the will no longer finds any reason to continue. It is not a product of striving, but a kind of grace, a natural dissolution of desire in the light of understanding. For most people, complete will denial remains an unreachable ideal rather than a tangible reality. At best, they may occasionally experience fleeting moments of detachment. During deep aesthetic immersion, acts of selfless compassion, or moments of profound philosophical clarity. These glimpses offer insight into what true liberation might feel like. Such moments, though temporary, can inspire further growth in that direction. Yet the lasting transcendence of all willing is as rare as true sainthood, attained perhaps by one in millions. Its rarity, however, does not diminish its value. Rather, it stands as the highest benchmark by which all other forms of human development can be measured. Even partial progress toward renouncing the will can meaningfully diminish suffering and foster a deeper, more authentic sense of peace and contentment. Schopenhauer recognized that his idea of ultimate liberation might appear bleak or nihilistic to those still invested in conventional human ambitions and pleasures. From the standpoint of ordinary awareness, rejecting the will to live seems akin to surrendering all the things that give life its value. However, he contended that this view fails to grasp the true character of both everyday fulfillment and the serenity that arises from transcending desire altogether. Conventional pleasures are inherently fleeting, shadowed by the fear of their loss, and inevitably give rise to new cravings that perpetuate the cycle of longing and discontent. In contrast, the tranquility that follows the denial of the will is enduring, self-sufficient, and unconditioned by anything external. This state is not defined by the absence of value, but rather by the emergence of the highest potential for human growth and realization.